Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to sleep. Tonight, we're going to wander into a question that sounds like it belongs in both a dream and a history book. A question that sits somewhere between archaeology and imagination. What if the first civilization, not just the first one we know, but the first one of all, never truly disappeared? What if, in some way we've forgotten how to hear, it's still guiding us? Now, I should say right from the start, this isn't about proving secret histories or decoding hidden conspiracies. It's about exploring a thought, softly, patiently, the way you might trace a pattern in sand, not to find an answer, but to see what shape it makes under your fingertips. If that sounds like the kind of slow wonder you'd like to drift through tonight, I'd be grateful if you gave the video a like or maybe subscribed. It helps this quiet corner of curiosity reach others who might need a calm place to rest their thoughts. Where are you listening from tonight? Maybe you're somewhere the air still holds the smell of the day's rain, or maybe it's a room where the hum of a distant refrigerator marks the rhythm of the evening. Wherever you are, take a breath, let your shoulders settle, and imagine with me for a while. Because if we're going to talk about the first civilization, we need to start with a simple truth. We don't really know where civilization began. Not exactly. There are ruins and stories, layers of sediment and carbon dating, lists of names like Sumer and Egypt and the Indus Valley. But the line between the first and the forgotten is thin. Every discovery changes the story. Every new excavation shifts the timeline just a little further back. It's as if the Earth itself is reluctant to reveal the full record, whispering it out piece by piece. For most of history, we've assumed that civilization began around 10,000 years ago, when humans started settling, planting, and building permanent structures. But the evidence keeps nudging that date backward. There are ruins in places we once thought were empty plains. There are carvings older than the invention of writing. There are stone circles built by people we didn't even think had agriculture. Each time something new is found, archaeologists have to rewrite a line in the long, slow story of us. And then there are the mysteries. Structures so large, so complex that they don't seem to fit the timeline we've built. Great stones cut and fitted without metal tools. City layouts that suggest geometry long before mathematics had a name. Art that looks like memory, not invention. They raise a quiet question that no one can fully answer. Did we build all this ourselves, starting from nothing? Or did we inherit something? Not a machine or a monument, but a seed of knowledge planted long before we can remember. It's tempting to imagine that humanity simply started over many times, that civilizations rise and fall like tides, leaving traces that the next wave will only partly recognize. Maybe the first one wasn't the grand empire we picture when we hear the word civilization. Maybe it was small, quiet, not defined by cities or armies, but by understanding. A civilization of observation, of people who notice things, how stars move, how seasons change, how patterns repeat in shells and rivers. People who knew that everything alive carries the memory of something before it. When you think about it, the Earth itself feels like a kind of living archive. Layers of rock pressed together like pages, each layer filled with the fossilized signatures of what came before. Volcanoes erupt, oceans shift, ice grinds mountains into dust. And yet, somewhere below, there are remnants of every age that's ever existed. Perhaps civilizations leave traces the same way, not just in ruins, but in influence. Maybe ideas, like minerals, can be buried and then uncovered again when the world is ready to use them. If that's true, it might explain why certain breakthroughs in human history feel like rediscoveries. Think of how we keep finding ancient technologies that seem to appear too early. Alloys, astronomical instruments, surgical tools. Maybe each one was a whisper from that first culture, surfacing again like a fossil in soft soil. Even our myths seem to carry faint echoes of something older. Nearly every culture tells a story about teachers who came from somewhere else, sometimes the sky, sometimes across the sea, and shared knowledge. Agriculture, mathematics, The calendar, the stars. The details vary, but the pattern repeats. A lost people gives the gift of civilization to the next. Over time, the story becomes a legend, then a god, then a bedtime story told around a fire. And yet, the memory endures. If you've ever stood in a museum and stared at an ancient statue, you might have felt it. That strange familiarity. The way the eyes seem to look not just out but through time, as if the sculptor's intent is still alive inside the stone. It's one of those small moments where you sense that history isn't just behind us, it's beside us, running parallel, sometimes touching, sometimes hidden beneath layers of dust and language. Imagine that somewhere deep underfoot, perhaps buried under oceans or swallowed by tectonic drift, lies the memory of the very first society that looked up at the night sky and realized it could understand it. They may have had no word for physics or philosophy, but they could have sensed connections. The tides responding to the moon, the seasons repeating, the cycle of growth and decay. They might have lived with such awareness that their understanding of the world wasn't written in books, but embedded directly in their surroundings. The arrangement of stones, the shape of fields, the orientation of dwellings, all part of a language we've since forgotten how to read. Some scientists call this the cultural amnesia theory, the idea that human history is longer and more cyclic than we remember. Catastrophes, climate shifts, floods, and eruptions could have erased entire civilizations, leaving only fragments. Those fragments become myths, and myths eventually become the foundations for the next cycle of civilization. It's not about aliens or magic. It's about the possibility that we are the continuation of something much older than we realize. If that first civilization was aware enough to observe long-term patterns in stars, in weather, in biology, they may have tried to leave their legacy in a form that could outlast memory itself. Not writing, not language, but principles. Universal truths encoded in art, architecture, and maybe even our instincts. If knowledge is passed genetically, as modern research into epigenetics suggests, then perhaps even our curiosity, this endless human urge to explore, build, and understand, could be part of that inheritance. Think about how every generation rediscovers the same fascinations. The stars, the ocean, the mystery of consciousness. We invent telescopes, submersibles, microscopes, but the subjects never change. Each time we dig deeper, it feels like déjà vu, like remembering something rather than discovering it. Could that be the voice of the first civilization, speaking not in words, but in curiosity itself? Our brains are remarkable record keepers. The same neural structures that allow us to remember our personal past might, in some way, be carrying echoes of our collective one. Ancient humans weren't separate from us. They are us, written in an older dialect of the same story. When we feel drawn to certain places, ancient ruins, sacred sites, or even quiet landscapes, it might be that we're responding to familiarity at a level deeper than language. The earth remembers, and through it, maybe we do too. Picture standing on a windswept plateau where the soil is thin and the stones are old enough to have seen civilizations come and go. You don't need to know their names to feel them. The way the air holds a silence that's heavier than sound, the way the horizon seems to lean just slightly forward, as if waiting to see what you'll do next. In that moment, you're both observer and continuation, another page being written in a book that began long before humans had alphabets. Some researchers, like those studying ancient astronomical sites, have noted that many of these structures align with the same constellations. Orion, Sirius, the Pleiades, the same stars worshipped and mapped across continents and eras. It's one of those patterns that feels too consistent to be coincidence. The same stellar guides appear again and again, as if each civilization was given the same homework assignment. Look up, remember, and record. Even the symbols carved into ancient stones, spirals, grids, circles, seem to repeat globally. It's possible they represent universal human perceptions like the sun, the moon, or the passage of time. But it's also possible that they were part of a shared symbolic language that originated far earlier than we've realised. A kind of proto-code that has survived in the collective unconscious, resurfacing in art and architecture throughout history. And yet, for all our curiosity, we rarely ask a simple question. Why do we keep trying to build permanence? Why are we as a species obsessed with creating things that last longer than we do? Whether it's pyramids or data servers, cathedrals or satellites, we seem compelled to leave traces that might outlive us. Perhaps that's instinctive, a kind of inherited instruction from that first civilization, passed down not as a command but as a habit. A quiet insistence that our purpose is not just to live, but to preserve memory. When we map DNA, when we preserve seeds, when we launch probes into interstellar space, we're doing what ancient builders did with stone, sending messages forward through time. The materials have changed, but the motive feels the same. Remember us. Continue. Some people find comfort in believing we're guided by something beyond ourselves, gods, fate, or cosmic intelligence. Others see guidance as a poetic way of describing evolution and continuity. But perhaps the truth is simpler. Maybe guidance is just memory, the world remembering itself through us. The atoms in your body were forged in ancient stars. The calcium in your bones might have once been part of a coral reef. The air in your lungs could have passed through the leaves of prehistoric trees. So why wouldn't the knowledge that shaped civilization also be circulating, recycled, resurfaced, waiting to be recognized again? When you think about humanity's trajectory, from stone tools to satellites, from cave paintings to quantum computing, it's astonishing how fast it all happened. 10,000 years is a blink in geological time. Maybe it happened so quickly because the blueprint wasn't being written from scratch. Maybe we were remembering how to build, not learning for the first time. Some scientists studying cultural evolution describe a phenomenon called cumulative culture. The idea that knowledge builds upon itself generation after generation, accelerating with each step. But perhaps the very first layer of that accumulation wasn't human invention at all. Perhaps it was inheritance from those who came before, from a civilization so ancient it no longer exists in any visible form, only in the frameworks of our thought. We might never find definitive proof. The past is fragile and most of it has already turned to dust. But the absence of proof doesn't erase the possibility. Every discovery begins as imagination, and every civilization begins as a story told around a fire. Maybe the story of the first civilization is one we're still telling without realizing it, through our science, our art, and our endless drive to understand the unknown. So as you settle deeper into your chair or your pillow, think about the ground beneath you. Somewhere under that thin crust of soil are the remains of thousands of generations. Bones, pottery, tools, seeds, traces of lives that once looked up at the same stars you see tonight. Maybe the guidance we're looking for isn't coming from above or beyond, but from below, from the layers of history still whispering through the dirt and stone, reminding us that the future and the past are made of the same material. And as we follow those whispers further, we might start to see patterns that connect us more deeply than we've ever imagined. Patterns that suggest the first civilization never truly vanished. It just changed form. The sun rises somewhere, as it always has, and with it the memory of everything that has ever stirred under its light. The first breath of morning carries the same warmth that once fell on valleys where no city stood, where silence and sky were the only architecture. When we talk about the beginning of civilization, it's easy to imagine it as a sudden spark, as if one day humanity simply decided to build temples, carve stone, and invent time. But beginnings aren't usually sudden. They unfold slowly like dawn, spreading across centuries rather than hours, until one day the light reaches a new place and we call it history. If you've ever watched the horizon before sunrise, you'll know that moment when the landscape is still half in shadow. Shapes are there, but uncertain. That's what the early record of civilization looks like. We see traces, stones placed with intent, carvings that suggest meaning, but the people behind them remain mostly invisible. Their names are gone, their voices erased, their stories replaced by what little we can guess. And yet, those faint outlines are enough to tell us that something extraordinary was happening long before the world we recognise began. Archaeologists often talk about thresholds, the moment when a species starts doing something that changes everything afterward. The threshold of fire, the threshold of tools, the threshold of farming. But the line that separates prehistory from civilization isn't as clear as it sounds. Farming didn't begin in one valley on one day. Writing didn't appear in a single flash of genius. These things grew out of patterns that must have been observed, shared, and refined for thousands of years. It's possible, even likely, that those patterns had been noticed by people who came before the first cities, before the first calendars, before anyone had words to explain what they were doing. When we look back now, we see a puzzle with most of its pieces missing. We have sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, built over 11,000 years ago, long before what we usually call civilization. Great stone pillars arranged with care, carved with animals and symbols, standing in circles like a message left for the future. Whoever built them had coordination, architecture, and artistry. But according to our timeline, they shouldn't have had those things yet. Agriculture was supposed to come first. Permanent settlements, then cities, then temples. But here was a temple before farming, before writing, before anything that fits our neat sequence. It's as if the order of invention had been flipped, as if they were rebuilding something they already remembered. And Göbekli Tepe isn't alone. There are submerged ruins off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean, buried beneath layers of silt that suggest they were built before the last ice age ended. That would place them tens of thousands of years before our earliest known cities. Some scientists caution against overinterpreting these finds. Erosion and geology can mimic architecture. But still, there are blocks that seem carved, patterns that look deliberate, and alignments that match ancient shorelines. The ocean has a way of erasing stories, but not perfectly. Sometimes it leaves just enough to make you wonder. Imagine a world at the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago. Sea levels were lower, climates unstable. Human populations were small but widespread, scattered along coasts and river valleys. These people weren't primitive in the way we often picture them. They had tools, trade, and art. They knew how to travel long distances and how to work with materials that lasted. They painted the inside of caves with animals they clearly understood, capturing movement, proportion, and emotion with skill that still humbles us. To call them ignorant would be absurd. They may not have had our technology, but they had perception, and perception, over enough generations, can become science. Perhaps civilization didn't start once. Perhaps it started several times, rising and falling like the tide. Each time the world changed, most of the evidence was washed away. When glaciers melted and coastlines shifted, entire regions vanished under the sea. When volcanoes erupted, they covered towns with ash. When droughts or floods came, people moved on, leaving behind only foundations. If you were to erase every modern city today, burn the books, rust the metal, bury the concrete, it would take only a few thousand years for nature to reclaim it all. Future archaeologists might find a few odd relics and try to piece together what kind of creatures we were, and if that's true for us, why not for others before us? There's a quiet theory among some researchers that civilization isn't a straight line, but a rhythm. It advances, collapses, forgets, and rediscovers. Each cycle leaves behind just enough knowledge for the next to pick up where it left off, though never quite remembering how it started. That could explain why certain discoveries seem to appear too early, and why similar inventions arise independently in distant cultures. Fire, agriculture, pyramids, astronomy. They show up again and again, like themes in a song that keeps repeating itself. The players change, The instruments evolve, but the melody is familiar. Even our oldest myths seem to remember that rhythm. Flood stories, for instance, appear almost everywhere, from Mesopotamia to the Americas to the Pacific Islands. They tell of an earlier world washed away, of survivors carrying knowledge into a new age. Maybe those stories aren't pure fiction. Maybe they're cultural memories of real events, disasters that ended previous civilizations, leaving only fragments behind. The survivors might have seemed like gods to those who came after, their technology misunderstood, their knowledge mythologized, and as the centuries passed, the memory of who they truly were blurred into legend. If you think about how knowledge travels, it's not hard to imagine how guidance from an earlier culture could persist even after that culture vanished. A small group of survivors could teach a few key ideas: how to build, how to plant, how to measure the sky, and those ideas would ripple outward. Within a few generations, the origin would be forgotten, but the practices would remain. When later civilizations arose, they'd claim those skills as their own inventions. In a sense, they would be. But the spark that began them might have come from somewhere older. We often underestimate how much can be preserved through oral tradition. Long before writing, people memorized vast amounts of information. Star positions, seasonal cycles, genealogies, laws, myths. Some Aboriginal Australian songlines, for example, are thought to encode maps and ecological knowledge that are tens of thousands of years old. The songs describe landmarks, water sources, and routes that still match the geography today. That's not folklore, that's navigation disguised as story. Imagine what else might survive in the world's oldest stories if we knew how to read them properly. Language itself may carry hints of the forgotten dawn. Linguists have tried to trace modern tongues back to their ancestral roots, and some have proposed that all human languages might share a distant common ancestor, a proto-language spoken tens of thousands of years ago. If true, it would mean that our very way of thinking, our syntax and rhythm of communication, could be a living fossil of that first civilization's mind. Even the words we use for earth, sky, or home might be echoes of concepts first spoken in a world we no longer remember. What's intriguing is how many early societies seem to build with an awareness of time on a vast scale. They oriented temples to solstices and equinoxes, tracked planetary movements, and marked cycles lasting thousands of years. That level of precision suggests not just observation but tradition. It takes generations to notice long-term patterns like precession or eclipses. Someone had to start those observations, pass them down and refine them over centuries. Could that lineage of knowledge have begun earlier than we think, before the supposed dawn of civilization? If so, it would mean that the first civilization's influence isn't hidden in lost cities or secret artifacts, but in the continuity of human curiosity itself. Every time we build an observatory, we're extending a conversation that began in the forgotten dawn. Every time we map the stars, we're participating in a dialogue that may have started with people who watched the sky by firelight long before our recorded history began. You can almost feel the weight of that continuity when you stand at an ancient site. The stones are silent but not lifeless. They hold geometry, symmetry, alignment, all deliberate, all purposeful. They point to something larger than themselves, and while we might argue over who built them or why, there's a deeper fact that's hard to ignore. The same drive that built those monuments still exists in us. We still measure, align, and calculate. We still search for order in the cosmos. If that instinct was taught once, it's never been forgotten. The forgotten dawn, then, isn't just a time in history. It's a phase that keeps repeating whenever humanity begins to remember itself. Every new era begins with rediscovery, a slow waking from sleep, and maybe what feels like progress is really the gradual restoration of something that was always ours. Some scientists look for physical evidence, structures, artifacts, tools. Others look for patterns in behaviour, in myth, in culture. But both are chasing the same thing, a glimpse of that first awakening. and though the material record may always be incomplete, the continuity of ideas tells its own story. Mathematics, for instance, appears fully formed in the earliest written records. Geometry in Egypt and Mesopotamia wasn't primitive. It was already sophisticated, suggesting that its roots were far older. The same applies to astronomy, to agriculture, even to governance. Systems don't appear perfect overnight. They evolve, or they're inherited. If a civilization before the known ones ever existed, its remnants may not be technological in the way we expect. They might be conceptual, ideas embedded so deeply in our shared behaviour that we no longer question their origin. The concept of measurement, the rhythm of calendars, the intuition that the universe has structure. These could all be inheritances from minds that watched the same sun rise at the beginning of another forgotten world. As the night deepens and the thought of that ancient dawn lingers, it's worth remembering how much of human history remains undiscovered. The majority of our planet's surface is covered by ocean, and most of the seafloor has never been explored in detail. Beneath those waters could lie entire chapters of our story, sealed away by time and tide. Perhaps one day technology will uncover them, or perhaps the Earth, in its slow turning, prefers to keep some memories to itself until we're ready to understand them. If the first civilization still guides us, it may do so not through deliberate influence, but through the momentum of inheritance. Every culture carries traces of the last. Every innovation is a translation of an older idea. Civilization may not be a creation at all, but a continuation. A torch passed through epochs, burning brighter and dimmer but never fully extinguished. The forgotten dawn isn't gone. It's simply the part of morning we no longer remember seeing. And as the first light of understanding continues to spread, humanity keeps walking forward, following that glow, not realizing it's the same light that once guided those who came before. Somewhere beyond the reach of written history, the first teachers may still be speaking, not in words, but in the quiet persistence of human curiosity, the same force that brings us here tonight, wondering who lit that flame in the first place. The stones that have outlasted us do not speak, yet they remember. They remember the pressure of hands that placed them, the weight of footsteps long turned to dust, the sound of wind shaped by walls that no longer stand. When we look at ancient ruins, we often see them as frozen in time, but they are still changing, still recording the slow dialogue between matter and memory. Every crack, every grain of lichen, every fallen block is a record of interaction between nature and intention. The story of civilization in many ways is written in stone, because stone is the one material that almost never forgets. Imagine walking through an ancient site where the walls rise only to your knees and the air smells faintly of earth and distance. The stones there seem simple, yet every placement was deliberate. Some align perfectly with the solstice sunrise, others trace the paths of forgotten constellations. They were not built randomly. They were shaped by observation, patience, and a desire to make permanence out of impermanence. If the first civilization left a message for the future, this might be where it still lives, carved not in words, but in alignment, weight, and rhythm. Stone endures where parchment decays and wood turns to ash. It is the language of longevity, and perhaps the oldest form of writing humanity ever used. Long before alphabets, long before anyone marked clay tablets, people were stacking, carving, balancing, and orienting stone in ways that conveyed meaning. The meaning wasn't always linguistic, sometimes it was astronomical, sometimes symbolic, sometimes practical. But the act itself, the impulse to shape stone into memory, connects us across tens of thousands of years. When archaeologists first began studying megalithic sites, they often assumed the builders were primitive, limited by simple tools and superstition. The neatness of their alignment and the scale of their construction didn't fit that image, so explanations turned to the mystical. It was easier to imagine giants or gods than to imagine a sophisticated people working with patience and purpose thousands of years before recorded history. But as research advanced, so did our respect for those builders. With each discovery, we learned that precision and intelligence existed long before writing or metal. Take Stonehenge in England, for instance. It isn't the oldest or the largest of its kind, but it may be the most studied. Its stones, some weighing more than 20 tons, were transported from quarries miles away, across hills and rivers, using only human ingenuity. When you stand inside that circle at dawn on the summer solstice, the sun rises exactly between two stones on the horizon. That alignment is not coincidence. It is geometry applied to nature, an attempt to link the movement of the heavens to the rhythm of the earth. No one knows exactly why it was built, whether for ceremony, calendar or both, but the intention is undeniable. The people who built it were measuring time not by clocks, but by light itself, and Stonehenge is not alone. Across the planet, from the temples of Malta to the stone circles of Senegal, the same principles appear: alignment with celestial events, careful geometry, mathematical proportion. It's as though builders separated by oceans and millennia were following the same unspoken instruction. Some researchers argue this was simply a universal human instinct, people everywhere observing the same sky, making the same conclusions. But there's another way to see it. What if they were all heirs to the same knowledge, inherited not through writing but through imitation, story and ritual? If the first civilization ever existed, its legacy would not necessarily survive in intact cities. Time erases buildings but preserves habits. The way a people shapes stone, organises space, or chooses orientation could carry more information than any inscription. The builders of later ages might not have known why they were doing it, only that it was important to do. They may have followed ancient rules without remembering their origin. Ritual often outlives reason. Consider the pyramids, perhaps the most famous stones of all. Their shape appears across continents: Egypt, Sudan, Mesoamerica, China. The scale and precision vary, but the form is constant, a stable geometry that seems instinctively right. The pyramid resists time, disperses weight, and mirrors the rays of the sun. It's both practical and symbolic, an architecture of endurance. When you climb the steps of one of those structures, you're moving through layers of human intention compressed into stone. Egypt's Great Pyramid aligns almost perfectly with the cardinal directions, accurate to a fraction of a degree. That precision is astonishing, especially for a structure built over 4,000 years ago using copper tools and manpower alone. It wasn't trial and error. It was inherited knowledge, geometry and engineering refined over generations, possibly longer. We tend to treat such precision as evidence of genius unique to one civilization, but perhaps it was part of a longer continuum. The builders of the Egyptian pyramids might have been carrying forward techniques that had already been passed down for centuries or millennia. The design could have been a tradition, not an invention. If that's true, the origin of the form may lie far deeper in history, rooted in an earlier culture that understood not just architecture but symbolism, the kind of symbolism that bridges mathematics and meaning. One of the most puzzling features of ancient construction is the way certain stones were cut and fitted with almost impossible accuracy. At sites like Pumapunku in Bolivia, massive andesite blocks fit together so precisely that even a sheet of paper cannot pass between them. The surfaces are flat, the edges perfectly right-angled, and the joints interlocking. Modern engineers still debate how such precision was achieved without advanced tools. Some suggest lost techniques. Others propose slow, patient craftsmanship, aided by knowledge we've simply forgotten. Either way, these stones demonstrate a level of understanding inconsistent with the era we assign them. It's as if their builders remembered methods that had been refined in an earlier age and used them one last time before they disappeared again. Even more fascinating are the patterns that emerge when you map ancient sites globally. Many of them share latitudinal relationships or geometric ratios that seem too consistent to be accidental. The distances between certain monuments align with planetary dimensions or mathematical constants. To some, that sounds like coincidence amplified by pattern seeking, but to others, it's evidence of a shared source of knowledge, a geometry of Earth known long before modern measurement. It's possible that the first civilization was less a single nation and more a network, a way of thinking that spread across early humanity like a template for how to relate to the world. Stone structures, after all, are not just shelters. They are instruments, devices that record light, sound, and time. Some researchers studying ancient acoustics have found that chambers inside temples or tombs resonate at specific frequencies, often near those produced by human voices. Chanting inside them can create vibrations that seem to amplify the sound far beyond what architecture alone should allow. Was that accidental or intentional? If intentional, it suggests that ancient builders understood resonance in a way both practical and spiritual. They may have treated sound as a kind of bridge between matter and mind. When you stand inside such a chamber, you can feel it. The air thickens, the echoes overlap and merge into a single sustained tone. You don't need to believe in magic to recognize that it affects the body. Sound becomes physical there. It's easy to imagine ceremonies where vibration itself was part of the communication, perhaps not just with each other, but with the world. The first civilization, if it existed, might have known that stone could act as both amplifier and memory, storing sound and energy in ways we still only partly understand. There's an interesting phenomenon in geology called piezoelectricity, the ability of certain crystals to generate voltage when subjected to pressure. Quartz, for instance, does this naturally. Many ancient structures contain large amounts of quartz-rich stone, granite, sandstone, basalt. It's possible that this wasn't coincidence. Perhaps the builders observed subtle effects, vibration, static, sound, and chose their materials accordingly. If they understood that stone could respond to pressure and resonance, they might have used it deliberately, not as mystics, but as early experimenters in natural physics. In that sense, stone monuments were not only art or religion, they were science. They were attempts to map relationships between the physical and the cosmic. Aligning with the sun wasn't worship, it was calibration. Building with symmetry wasn't superstition, it was data made durable. Each generation might have lost a little of the reasoning but kept the practice. And somewhere at the root of that chain could be the blueprint of the first civilization. A people who decided that to understand the universe, you had to build it into your surroundings. When you walk among those ruins today, you participate in that continuity. The feeling of awe you experience standing before an ancient temple or a carved monolith is a kind of recognition. Your mind recognizes order even if it doesn't know why. You notice proportion, balance, harmony, the same things the builders noticed. The stones remember because they were shaped by those perceptions, and when we sense that memory, we're remembering alongside them. Even in places where the stones are uncarved, there's evidence of deliberate placement. In parts of the world where glaciers once retreated, people rearranged boulders into lines or circles that mirrored constellations. Some of these alignments are so old they predate agriculture. That means the impulse to build meaning from stone was older than farming, older than cities. Perhaps it began as a form of translation, an attempt to make the language of the stars tangible on the ground. If that's true, then the stones are part of a conversation between earth and sky that has been going on for tens of thousands of years. Modern technology has begun revealing things the naked eye can't see. Using satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar, archaeologists have found entire complexes buried under soil and vegetation. Some are arranged with the same geometric precision as the ones above ground. The more we look, the more we realize how little we've uncovered. Civilizations thought to be isolated were often connected by trade, migration, or shared ideas. What we call coincidence might instead be communication, recorded not in writing but in architecture. There's something humbling about the realization that stone outlasts everything we build upon it. Wood rots, metal corrodes, but stone persists. Even when it collapses, it stays nearby, waiting to be reused. Many ancient temples were built on the foundations of earlier ones, their blocks repurposed. Sometimes you can see the difference. The older stone's darker, denser, more precisely cut than the newer layers above. It's as if later builders were reassembling a puzzle they didn't fully understand, guided by fragments of an older design. In that way, the first civilization might still be building through us, its stones recycled endlessly into new forms. Our fascination with stone hasn't faded. We still carve it for monuments, stack it for walls, and use it to mark boundaries. Even our gravestones are echoes of this ancient habit. Memories made solid, meant to resist forgetting. When we build with stone, we participate in a lineage stretching back to the forgotten dawn. Perhaps we do it instinctively, knowing that stone connects us to something immovable, something that remembers when everything else fades. If you think about it, our modern cities are also built from stone, just refined and repurposed. The concrete in our buildings is powdered limestone, the glass in our windows melted sand, the steel in our bridges mined from the bones of the earth. We're still using the same materials, only disguised. The impulse hasn't changed, only the form. We're still turning the planet into memory, still shaping permanence out of transience. When you step outside and feel the solidity of the ground beneath you, that's the same stone that held the feet of those first builders. It carries the imprint of their decisions, their experiments, their beliefs. And in a very real sense, it carries us too. Every building, every city, every monument is balanced on the accumulated labour of the past. Whether we acknowledge it or not, the stones beneath our world are part of the same story that began when someone long ago decided to place one rock on top of another for a reason only they knew. Perhaps the first civilization's greatest achievement wasn't a specific structure or invention. Maybe it was the realization that permanence is a form of communication, that by shaping the environment deliberately, you can speak across millennia. That idea alone might be the message we've been following all along. Every civilization since has tried to leave its mark, to say, we were here. The first civilization might have been the one that taught us how. If you ever visit an ancient site, pause for a moment before you start analysing or photographing it. Stand still and listen. The sound you hear isn't silence, it's memory settling. The stones don't speak in language, but they respond to attention. They remind you that everything we build is part of something older, something ongoing. Civilization isn't a collection of cities or empires. It's the long conversation between human intention and the material world, carried forward through stone and still unfolding beneath our feet. And as the night drifts on, the thought remains that maybe the first civilization never needed to survive physically to keep guiding us. Its memory could be encoded in the very act of building itself, in our hands, our instincts, our urge to shape and align. The stones that remember might not be relics at all. They might be participants, still doing their quiet work, still holding the blueprint of how humanity remembers itself. The sky has always been humanity's oldest screen, a shifting map of light and movement that every generation has stared at, wondering what it all means. Before writing, before cities, before the concept of time itself was pinned down into hours and calendars, people were looking up and seeing patterns. Those patterns weren't just decoration. They were information. They were stories. They were a guide. The same sun that wakes us each morning once rose as a god to entire civilizations, and the same stars we see now once marked the cycles of life for people whose names we'll never know. When we talk about the first civilization, we usually look down at stones, ruins, tools, but maybe we should be looking up. Because if there was ever a knowledge that could survive across ages, it would be the sky. The stars don't crumble or erode. They don't sink beneath the sea or get buried in dust. They return every night, and they've been returning for as long as eyes have opened to see them. The sky's the only monument that never collapses. It's easy to underestimate what early humans knew. We picture them as primitive observers, vaguely aware of the moon and the sun. But the evidence suggests something much more precise. Long before telescopes, people recorded eclipses, mapped constellations, predicted planetary alignments, and tracked precession. The slow wobble of Earth's axis that shifts the position of stars across millennia. To notice precession, you'd need centuries of continuous observation. No single lifetime could confirm it. That means knowledge was being preserved and handed down across generations, like a relay of understanding stretching back into prehistory. Sites like Nabta Playa in southern Egypt show this continuity clearly. There, in what is now desert, ancient people arranged stones into a circle aligned with the summer solstice sunrise, about 7,000 years ago. That's older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, and far too early for what we'd call astronomy. Yet the builders knew exactly where the sun would rise and set year after year. They tracked it carefully enough to build something permanent around it. That's not luck. That's data collection over lifetimes. Similar alignments appear across continents. In Central America, the Maya built temples that track the motion of Venus with extraordinary precision. In Ireland, the Passage tomb at Newgrange floods with sunlight only once a year, on the winter solstice, illuminating carvings that seem to celebrate rebirth. In the Andes, the ancient site of Machu Picchu lines up with the cardinal directions and marks solstices with stone windows cut to catch the light exactly. None of these cultures could have known about each other, and yet they built in the same language of light and shadow. The blueprint, it seems, was written in the sky. Why did they do it? Practical reasons, of course, knowing when to plant, when to harvest, when the floods would come. But beyond practicality, there's something deeper. The act of aligning architecture with celestial motion suggests a belief that the heavens and the earth are connected, that human life mirrors cosmic order. To live in harmony meant to live in rhythm with the sky. That idea, repeated across ages, might be the most enduring inheritance of all. Some researchers have proposed that ancient astronomers encoded complex information about cycles and orbits into myth. When they spoke of gods battling in the heavens, or of serpents chasing the sun, they might have been describing planetary movements in symbolic language. Myths about floods, fires, or world ages could have been poetic ways of recording astronomical events like comet impacts or axial shifts. In this view, mythology wasn't fantasy. It was memory, a durable archive disguised as story. If the first civilization truly guided those that followed, this could have been one of their methods. You can't preserve scientific records indefinitely, but you can preserve stories. A myth retold generation after generation can survive for tens of thousands of years, carrying fragments of real events or knowledge. And if you weave that information into rituals and festivals, it becomes self-sustaining. The people who repeat it may forget why, but the pattern endures. The story keeps the data alive. Consider how many cultures across time imagine the sky as a map of meaning. The Greeks traced gods into constellations. The Chinese saw dragons and palaces. The Polynesians used stars as navigational grids, guiding them across thousands of miles of ocean, with precision rivaling modern GPS. The Aboriginal Australians read constellations not by the stars themselves, but by the dark spaces between them, creating a mirrored landscape that matched the geography below. Each interpretation is different, but all share one thing: the conviction that the heavens hold guidance. To ancient observers, the sky wasn't distant. It was participatory. The stars were part of the same system as the earth and the people on it. A sunrise wasn't just light. It was renewal. A full moon wasn't decoration. It was signal. The cosmos wasn't separate from human life. It was its extension. That worldview might have been the greatest legacy of the first civilization. The idea that knowledge isn't owned, it's observed, and that truth reveals itself to those who pay attention to patterns. The more we uncover, the more it seems that early cultures saw the universe as a unified structure rather than a collection of isolated parts. Modern physics, in a way, has circled back to that idea. We now know that gravity, matter, and time are all interconnected, that everything influences everything else, but perhaps that understanding isn't new. Perhaps it's a rediscovery of something ancient, an intuition encoded into myth, architecture, and ritual long before equations existed. Take, for example, the pyramids of Giza. They're aligned almost perfectly with true north, a feat requiring astronomical precision. Some studies suggest the layout mirrors the three stars of Orion's belt. To the ancient Egyptians, Orion was associated with Osiris, god of the afterlife and rebirth. Aligning the pyramids with Orion wasn't symbolic, it was literal architecture as theology, geometry as cosmology. The dead pharaoh's soul, they believed, would ascend along the same cosmic path those stars traced across the night. Whether or not you accept that interpretation, the fact remains that the builders understood stellar motion better than they should have for their time. Perhaps they were following knowledge older than Egypt itself. In the ruins of Chichen Itza, a temple stands that plays with sunlight as if it were an instrument. On the equinox, a shadow falls along the steps of the pyramid in the shape of a serpent descending from the top. It's a calculated illusion, built to coincide with the sun's position on only 2 days of the year. To design that, you need an intimate understanding of solar geometry. The Maya didn't stumble upon that precision. They inherited it, refined it, and embedded it into their culture so deeply that it became inseparable from their identity. In some ways, modern science has only just begun to appreciate how advanced such systems were. For centuries, Western historians dismissed ancient astronomy as superstition. But when computers began modelling star positions backward through time, many alignments once thought coincidental turned out to be exact. The builders weren't guessing, they were measuring. Their instruments were the sky itself, and their laboratory was time. It's humbling to realise that what we call discovery often turns out to be recognition. When we launch telescopes into orbit to study distant galaxies, we're continuing a tradition that began when someone looked up from a firelit camp and decided to track a star's path with a stick and a line in the dirt. The tools have changed, but the intention hasn't. That intention, to understand our place in the cosmos, might be the thread that connects us directly to the first civilization. If those early teachers existed, maybe they weren't builders at all. Maybe they were observers, people who noticed patterns so vast and consistent that they began to see the structure behind existence itself. They might not have had language for physics or astronomy, but they could have grasped the same principles we describe mathematically today. The symmetry of orbits, the cycles of light and dark, the repetition of form in nature, all of it points toward an underlying order. Once you see that order, it's impossible to unsee it. You start to shape your life and your world around it. That, in essence, is civilization. There's a quiet connection between how ancient people watched the heavens and how they built on Earth. Architecture became a mirror of astronomy. The shape of temples, the orientation of doorways, even the layout of cities often reflected cosmic principles. Some sites are designed around the cardinal directions, others around star clusters or solar events. It's as if each culture was trying to anchor the infinite to the tangible, to turn the abstract movement of stars into a blueprint you could walk through. Even more fascinating is how these alignments could serve as time capsules. Because of precession, the stars shift slowly over thousands of years. A temple aligned with a certain star when it was built will eventually fall out of sync as centuries pass. By measuring the current misalignment, we can estimate when the structure was originally aligned. In that sense, ancient builders unknowingly left us a dating system encoded in starlight. They made time measurable through architecture. That's not coincidence. That's brilliance disguised as ritual. One could argue that what we call science began not in laboratories but under open skies. Counting stars led to counting seasons, which led to counting harvests, which led to counting time. The first calendars weren't inventions, they were translations of celestial rhythm. Once humanity could predict the heavens, it could predict the future, not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. When you know when the floods will come, when the rains will return, when the sun will reach its highest point, you can plan, plant, and survive. The sky became the first teacher, and perhaps that teacher's lessons were first compiled by the civilization we've lost to time. Some researchers suggest that the first civilization might have been coastal, dependent on the sea and the stars for navigation. The ocean erases its footprints easily, but navigation requires pattern recognition. To travel by starlight, you must know the night sky intimately, memorizing constellations, their seasonal positions, and their relationship to the horizon. That kind of knowledge could spread quickly, shared from one group to another through trade and travel. It could have been the first global language, the stars themselves as words, the sky as the text. Even today, when we map the stars, we rely on systems built upon those ancient observations. The zodiac, for instance, originated from constellations that mark the sun's path through the sky thousands of years ago. It began as a calendar, not as fortune-telling. Each sign represented a segment of the year, helping early astronomers and farmers align their work with celestial cycles. Over time, those signs became symbolic, their original purpose blurred but not erased. That's how knowledge survives when its meaning is forgotten. It transforms into culture. There's also something deeply human in our tendency to assign personality to the stars. We turned patterns into stories because stories are how memory travels. The hunter, the scorpion, the twins, the lion. These aren't random shapes. They're mnemonic devices, aids to recall. A star map by itself is data. A constellation myth is data you can remember. Perhaps the first civilization understood this and embedded its teachings within narratives to ensure they would endure. That's not superstition. That's pedagogy. If you go outside on a clear night, far from city lights, and look up, you're seeing the same sky that those early astronomers saw. The light reaching your eyes began its journey thousands of years ago. Some of those photons left their stars before the pyramids were built, before the first words were written, before anyone knew how to count the years. You are literally seeing the past. In that sense, astronomy is not just science, it's time travel. The stars are history glowing in the present tense. Maybe that's why humans have always felt that the heavens hold answers. They do, not in the mystical sense, but in the factual one. The universe is a record of its own story, written in radiation, gravity, and motion. To read it is to remember where we came from. The first civilization, if it existed, might have been the first to realize that the sky isn't just above us, it's a mirror of us. Every cycle we live, from sleep to birth to decay, follows patterns that the stars have been tracing since the beginning. Even now, when we send satellites and telescopes into orbit, we're continuing the same gesture. We're still building monuments to observation, only higher up. Each spacecraft is a new kind of temple, floating where ancient builders once pointed their stones. The desire to know, to measure, to align. It's the same impulse, updated with circuits and algorithms instead of stone and sunlight. And maybe that's exactly what the first civilization hoped we would keep doing. Looking, learning, aligning ourselves with the vast and patient sky. If they are still guiding us, perhaps they don't need to intervene directly. The patterns they recognized are still there, repeating eternally. All we have to do is notice them. The stars don't hide knowledge, they display it openly. It's up to each generation to decide whether to see chaos or order, myth or mathematics. The sky teaches both equally well. As you lie beneath it, perhaps ready for sleep, consider that every culture that has ever existed has looked at the same constellations and found meaning. The connection we feel to the night sky is older than language, older than history. It might be the oldest inheritance of all, a silent conversation stretching across time, a map not of places but of understanding. And as we continue to watch, to measure, to wonder, maybe we're not inventing new knowledge at all. Maybe we're just remembering what was shown to us at the very beginning, when the first civilization stood under this same sky and realized it was alive with pattern, and that pattern was speaking to anyone patient enough to listen. If you listen closely to language, you can almost hear the sediment of time layered inside it. Words carry history like fossils, shapes and sounds pressed together by countless generations. Every phrase we speak is the result of thousands of years of repetition, correction, and memory. In that way, language is the oldest living artifact we possess. Unlike stone or metal, it's alive, always moving, always changing. Yet even as it changes, it never truly forgets. It adapts. It hides what it remembers in plain sound. Imagine the first people who decided that noises could mean things. It's a moment we can't really picture because we've never known silence of that kind. A world without shared names, without syntax, without the invisible bridge between one mind and another. Somewhere, at some time, a sound became a sign, and meaning began. That might have been humanity's first true act of creation. Not fire, not tools, but the agreement that vibration could carry thought. Once that happened, civilization was inevitable. But what if language didn't begin just once? What if it was inherited? Not in vocabulary, but in instinct. Children learn to speak naturally because the capacity for language is already inside them. It's not just mimicry, it's built into the wiring of the brain. Some linguists believe this instinct is ancient enough to predate modern humanity itself. If so, the impulse to name, to describe, to share could be a legacy older than Homo sapiens. A remnant of an earlier culture that discovered communication not by accident, but by design. Every language we know today, from Mandarin to English to Quechua, carries structural echoes of others that came before. You can trace sounds back through families, like genetic lineages. Indo-European languages, for example, share common ancestors that can be reconstructed with surprising accuracy. But beyond that, some scholars have searched for what they call proto-human language, the theoretical original tongue spoken before people spread across continents. Its words are long lost, but traces of its rhythm and syntax might still survive, buried inside the patterns of how we form thoughts. That rhythm, the way sentences move and meanings layer, could be the last surviving whisper of the first civilization. Because language is more than vocabulary, it's architecture of thought. The structure of grammar shapes how we perceive reality. Some languages divide the world into animate and inanimate. Others mark gender, tense, or relationship. Each system reflects how its speakers understand existence. If the first civilization built the framework, then everything we've said since might still be using their blueprint. It's remarkable how languages separated by oceans share similar metaphors. The way we describe time, for instance, often links it to space, something you can move through or look ahead toward. Cultures that have never met use the same conceptual mapping. Why? Possibly because we all inherited the same cognitive scaffolding, a mental architecture that defines how thought can be expressed. That structure might not just be biological evolution, it might be cultural inheritance so ancient that it's become inseparable from biology itself. The oldest written languages we've discovered already appear mature. Sumerian, Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Indus script. They don't look experimental. They're organised, systematic, and rule-based. That suggests a long prehistory of oral communication before writing ever began. You don't invent grammar overnight. It evolves from centuries of conversation, teaching, and correction. So the question is, who started it? If the first civilization existed before the known ones, they might have perfected oral language long before symbols were carved into clay or stone. Writing could have been a rediscovery, an attempt to preserve something that was already ancient. Even today, we still find remnants of that forgotten linguistic past in myths, chants, and ritual phrases that have survived unchanged for millennia. Certain words, sounds that evoke earth, sky, water, and fire, recur across distant cultures. It's tempting to think that's coincidence, but the human brain is capable of remarkable consistency when it comes to sound symbolism. Some shapes of sound simply feel like what they represent. Mama, for instance, appears in almost every language, because the labial me is one of the easiest sounds for infants to make, and it naturally becomes linked to the person they depend on most. But beyond that, there are deeper patterns. Words for water often use flowing or open vowels. Words for hard things often use sharp consonants. It's as though sound itself carries a universal logic, a shared memory that predates culture. When you listen to an ancient language spoken aloud, say, reconstructed Sumerian or Old Egyptian, it has a strange familiarity. You can't understand the words, but the intonation feels recognizable. It's as if your mind knows what kind of meaning is being carried, even if it doesn't know the code. That may not be imagination. Linguistic archetypes, intonations tied to emotion or environment, are neurologically embedded. We respond to tone as much as to meaning. A command, a comfort, a question. They each have global rhythms. Those rhythms could be the most enduring language of all, passed not through teaching but through inheritance. Think about how humans communicate beyond speech. Gesture, facial expression, body posture. These are universal languages that even infants understand. You don't need to be taught to recognize a smile or a frown. Our ancestors must have relied heavily on these forms before words evolved, and perhaps they never stopped. The first civilization might have used a combination of sound and gesture so fluid that words, movement and meaning were one continuous act. Some indigenous languages today still preserve traces of that unity, where spoken words and physical movement complete each other. It's a reminder that language isn't confined to sound, it's embodied. There's a concept in linguistics called linguistic relativity, the idea that the language you speak shapes the way you think. For example, in some Australian Aboriginal languages, there are no words for left or right. Directions are always described as north, south, east, or west. Speakers of those languages maintain a perfect sense of orientation even in darkness, because they constantly reference the world spatially. Their cognition has adapted to their linguistic system. If the first civilization designed its language intentionally, perhaps it did so to shape perception, to align human thought with certain truths about the universe. A language engineered to teach awareness could outlive its creators simply by shaping the minds of their descendants. We might still be thinking in that language without realizing it. The abstract categories we use, time, matter, cause, self, could be inherited mental structures. The fact that nearly every human culture divides reality into similar concepts suggests that we didn't each invent them independently. They might be linguistic fossils from a common origin. And if language shapes reality, then the first civilization's greatest creation may not have been a city or a monument, but a worldview encoded in syntax. When archaeologists find artifacts inscribed with unknown symbols, they often say, "We don't know what this means." But maybe the meaning isn't in the symbols themselves. It's in how they're arranged, in the structure that implies order. Every language carries patterns of symmetry and balance, often reflecting natural cycles. Ancient scripts frequently use repetition, mirroring and parallelism, not just for aesthetics but for emphasis. The same principle appears in architecture, art and even mathematics. Perhaps all of these disciplines share a common ancestor, a single cognitive template that first expressed itself through speech, and later through everything else. Consider how music functions. It's structured sound governed by rhythm, pitch and repetition. Those same features exist in spoken language. In fact, in many early societies, the two were indistinguishable. Stories were sung, laws were recited in verse, and memory was tied to melody. This wasn't just art. It was information storage. Rhyme and rhythm make data easier to remember. Oral cultures could preserve thousands of lines of text accurately through generations because the structure of sound helped them. That technique may be as old as humanity itself. Music and speech might have evolved together as tools for preserving knowledge when nothing else could. Even in our time, echoes of those ancient techniques survive. Nursery rhymes, chants, hymns, even advertising slogans all rely on repetition and rhythm to make meaning stick. Our brains are wired to respond to those patterns. That wiring isn't new, it's inherited. Every time we sing, teach, or tell stories, we're participating in the same process that began when language itself was young. Perhaps that's the real continuity between us and the first civilization. We still use vibration to pass memory from one mind to another. There's something quietly astonishing about the idea that the entire human story might be one long conversation, passed across ages, constantly translated but never interrupted. Each generation adds, subtracts, refines, and misunderstands, yet the dialogue continues. Words evolve, meanings shift, but the impulse remains unchanged. We're still trying to say what the first people were trying to say. Here we are. This is what we see. This is what we've learned. This is what we want you to remember. In some ancient cultures, names were considered powerful because they preserved identity beyond death. To speak someone's name was to keep them alive. Maybe that belief was more literal than symbolic. If language truly preserves thought, then each time we reuse an ancient word, we're carrying forward a fragment of consciousness. The sound is the same, the meaning may have shifted, but the vibration connects us directly to those who spoke it first. The first civilization, in that sense, may never have stopped speaking. It may still echo in every sentence we form. Linguists often point out that no language is static. Even isolated tribes develop slang and change pronunciation over time. Yet despite all this fluidity, there are constants, deep structural similarities that seem universal. Every language distinguishes nouns from verbs, for example. Every language has a way to express negation and causation. These are not arbitrary. They're reflections of how the human brain organizes reality. If those cognitive structures were shaped by an ancient linguistic framework, then the blueprint of the first civilization is embedded in our neurology. We're not just descendants biologically, we're descendants linguistically. Some researchers in cognitive archaeology have even proposed that the invention of complex language may have triggered the leap from small bands of humans to organized societies. Communication allowed coordination, teaching, and shared memory. Once knowledge could be stored in speech rather than experience, progress became exponential. That means the first civilization might not have needed advanced technology. Its true achievement could have been linguistic. A culture that realized the power of language to structure thought, unify action, and preserve time. If that's true, then their legacy isn't something we can dig up. It's something we speak every day without noticing. Every idiom, every metaphor, every way we link cause to effect could be a relic of their instruction. The words have changed, but the grammar of thought remains. It's a living fossil, an unbroken thread stretching from the dawn of awareness to the present. There's a line between myth and memory, and language walks that line perfectly. It turns history into story and story into instruction. Even when meaning drifts, emotional truth persists. That's why certain myths still resonate thousands of years later. They describe universal experiences, love, loss, fear, wonder, using patterns so old they feel instinctive. Perhaps those patterns were deliberately chosen long ago to ensure continuity, to make sure that no matter how the words changed, the feelings they conveyed would still be understood. When you listen to someone speak in a language you don't know, you can often tell whether they're angry, gentle, joking, or sad. That shared intuition might be one of the few remaining universal languages. It bypasses translation. It's the part of communication that belongs to biology, to shared humanity. The The first civilization may have cultivated that sense deliberately, understanding that emotion could carry meaning across cultures better than symbols ever could. In modern times, we tend to separate logic and emotion, reason and feeling. But ancient languages didn't always draw that line. In many of them, the same word could mean both to think and to feel. That overlap suggests a worldview where intellect and empathy weren't opposites but companions. If the first civilization shaped language, maybe they designed it to keep that unity intact. Over time, as societies grew more complex, we fragmented meaning for precision, and in doing so, we may have lost some of that original wholeness. Still, fragments of that unity persist. You can find them in proverbs that sound simple but carry layers of insight. You can hear them in lullabies, in poetry, in the unspoken understanding between people who share no common tongue, yet manage to communicate. Those are the places where the old language lives, beneath translation, beneath syntax, beneath noise. When linguists reconstruct proto-languages, they often begin with basic vocabulary, words for family, nature, survival. But the true essence of a language lies not in nouns but in relationships. How ideas connect, how cause leads to effect, how possibility is expressed. Those relational patterns could be the fingerprints of the first civilization's mind. They reveal not what our ancestors knew, but how they thought. As night stretches on and the mind drifts through the hum of history, it's comforting to think that the voices of the first teachers never really faded. They just changed form. Their words may no longer be carved into stone or sung by the fire, but their cadence persists in the rhythm of speech, in the pulse of every conversation. Whenever we share knowledge, whenever we tell a story or ask a question, we're continuing a dialogue that began long before the first alphabet, perhaps even before the first cities. The language that never died isn't a mystery to decode. It's what we're speaking right now, without realizing that every sound, every sentence, every idea is another step in a conversation that began with the first breath of thought and still hasn't ended. Everywhere you look, the traces of human hands are visible, on walls, in stone, across the soil, pressed into clay, etched into glass and coded into metal. Hands are the original architects of memory. They build, break, fix and repeat the same motion century after century, as though rehearsing something they've always known how to do. When we talk about civilization, we often describe ideas and inventions, but the true continuity of progress lives in the hands that carry those ideas forward. Every tool, every seed, every structure began as an act of touch. The story of civilization is written not only in thought, but in calluses. If you've ever watched someone working with their hands, shaping wood, planting crops, mixing pigment, you'll notice a rhythm that feels both modern and ancient. The motions are efficient, familiar, precise. They don't look invented, they look remembered. There's a quiet argument to be made that the first civilization, if it truly existed, passed its knowledge not through words or symbols but through practice. Actions that became habits, habits that became culture. The way a potter centers clay, the way a farmer measures distance with steps, the way a builder tests balance with their palm. All of these gestures carry ancestral instruction, the kind that doesn't need to be written down because the body remembers it. Anthropologists sometimes refer to this as embodied knowledge. It's learning that lives in movement rather than language. You can't explain it entirely, you have to do it. A violinist can't describe the feeling of bow pressure in words. A carpenter can't fully translate the sense of a perfectly even plane. Skill is its own language, and it's passed from hand to hand like an unspoken legacy. Perhaps the first civilization understood that better than anyone, that information stored in bodies lasts longer than anything carved into stone. Long before machines, the human hand was the most advanced instrument on Earth. It built homes, shaped tools, and painted images on cave walls that have survived for tens of thousands of years. Those early artists used pigments made from soil, ash, and crushed minerals, materials that came directly from the earth. And often, alongside the paintings, they left handprints. Not signatures exactly, but imprints of identity. Sometimes they were positive prints, made by pressing the palm onto the wall. Other times they were negatives, hands held against stone while pigment was blown around them, leaving a shadow of presence. Each one says the same thing. I was here. I saw. I touched. That gesture might be the oldest message in the human record. Archaeologists have found these handprints across continents, from Europe to Australia to South America. The surprising part is how similar they are. The same spread of fingers, the same scale, the same mixture of curiosity and purpose. It's unlikely that those artists ever met, yet they expressed themselves in identical ways. The repetition suggests something deeper than coincidence, something shared in the human template. It's possible that this instinct to leave a mark with our hands predates recorded history by tens of thousands of years, a behaviour passed down from an earlier society that already understood the symbolic power of creation. Building, too, seems to follow an inherited rhythm. When early humans began stacking stones into shelters, they didn't do it randomly. They used geometry, crude but effective. Triangles for stability, arches for balance, circles for strength. Those same shapes appear in structures thousands of years apart. The circular huts of early settlements echo the domes of later temples. The symmetry of a woven fence anticipates the lattice of modern architecture. Even when materials changed, from wood to brick to concrete, the logic stayed the same. The geometry of shelter is a language we've been speaking since we first learned to shape the environment. It's tempting to think we invented engineering through trial and error, but there's another possibility. What if the principles were already known, discovered once long ago and then remembered instinctively? The way children pick up language without formal instruction might mirror how early builders picked up architecture. The knowledge could have been encoded not genetically, but culturally, carried in stories, rituals, or even games that mimicked structural logic. Over generations, the reason for the ritual would fade, but the behaviour would persist, ensuring the technique survived even after its origin was forgotten. We can see this persistence most clearly in tools. The first hammer, the first knife, the first wheel, all appeared long before written history, yet their designs remain recognisable today. Modern versions are refined, not reinvented. The basic forms work because they follow natural patterns: leverage, rotation, symmetry. These are universal principles, but how did people discover them? Was it purely accident, or was it inheritance? The first civilization, if it existed, might have identified those laws early and embedded them into daily life. Every tool would then carry not only function but philosophy, a way of interacting with the world that was both practical and symbolic. The way people worked also reveals something about their worldview. In many early societies, craftsmanship wasn't just labour, it was sacred. Building a wall or carving a figure was an act of alignment with nature, not domination over it. The hands that built were not just working, they were participating in a cosmic order. That idea appears again and again in later cultures. In Egypt, artisans were considered priests of form. In Greece, architecture was tied to harmony and proportion. In Japan, carpenters still speak of working with the wood, not against it. These beliefs might all descend from an original philosophy of creation, a set of principles that the first civilization developed to ensure that every act of construction reinforced rather than disrupted the balance of the world. You can trace that continuity in how ancient builders treated materials. Stone was not just stone, it had personality. Wood had spirit. Metal had temperament. Craftsmen learned to listen to the materials they used, to understand how they wanted to be shaped. That mindset wasn't superstition, it was a recognition of interdependence. When you build with sensitivity to the properties of matter, you build things that last. The pyramids, the temples, the aqueducts, They endure because their makers respected physics even before it was defined. And yet, the first civilization's most enduring influence might not be in architecture or tools, but in agriculture. The act of planting a seed and expecting a future harvest is civilization itself condensed into a gesture. It requires foresight, patience, and trust in cycles. Archaeological evidence shows that farming appeared independently in several regions around the same time: Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica. For such a complex shift to happen nearly simultaneously across the planet suggests either communication or a shared inheritance of knowledge. Maybe the first civilization didn't vanish completely. Maybe its people travelled, teaching scattered groups how to cultivate and store food. Over time, their presence faded into myth, the bringers of crops, the teachers of seasons. Every myth about gods descending from the sky or arriving across the sea with gifts of knowledge could be a distorted memory of real encounters. Imagine small groups of survivors from an earlier world visiting simpler communities, sharing what they knew about farming, astronomy, and construction. To the locals, they would have seemed supernatural. To us, they would look like teachers. And as centuries passed, those stories would become divine narratives, their truth preserved through reverence. Whether or not that happened, what matters is that the hands of humanity learned to work with time itself. A farmer planting a seed is doing the same thing an engineer does when designing a bridge, turning imagination into structure. Both acts begin in the mind but must pass through the hands to become real. That continuity of transformation might be our oldest technology. Every civilization that followed simply expanded it, finding new ways to shape matter in the image of intention. If you study the evolution of tools, you notice something interesting. Progress doesn't move in a straight line. It happens in bursts followed by long plateaus. Entire techniques appear suddenly, far ahead of their time, and then disappear for centuries before reappearing elsewhere. Bronze casting, concrete, even certain kinds of metallurgy, all invented, lost and rediscovered. It's as if humanity keeps remembering fragments of a manual it once knew by heart. Each rediscovery is both innovation and recollection, a brief reconnection with an older pattern. The same pattern appears in art. Consider how certain forms, spirals, grids, interlocking shapes, recur across millennia. They're found in Neolithic carvings, in medieval manuscripts, in modern design. They appear in textiles, pottery, architecture, and digital graphics. The repetition suggests that the human hand, when left to create freely, gravitates towards specific geometries. Those shapes are not just aesthetic, they mirror natural laws. Spirals follow the growth of shells, the motion of galaxies. Grids reflect order and measure. Perhaps the first civilization noticed these patterns and taught that beauty is simply nature understood through craft. In that sense, every builder, artist, and engineer today is following a philosophy older than history, to make something that echoes the structure of the universe. The hands that built the future are not just physical, they're conceptual. They translate complexity into form. When an architect calculates a curve, when a coder arranges logic into function, when a sculptor refines a surface, they're all participating in the same ancient pursuit, to make the unseen visible. Even the very idea of progress might come from that inheritance. Progress implies direction, a sense that what comes next can improve upon what came before, but evolution alone doesn't explain that confidence. It feels taught. It feels intentional. The first civilization might have instilled not only knowledge but momentum, a belief that creation is endless, that each generation's duty is to extend what was handed down. That belief persists everywhere. We see it in education, in innovation, in our obsession with the future. We keep building not because we're restless, but because we've been instructed long ago to continue. Our tools now extend far beyond hands. Machines do the lifting, robots the assembling, algorithms the calculating. Yet all of it originates in manual logic, the geometry of touch. Even the word digital comes from digit, meaning finger. The most advanced technology we possess still bears the name of the body part that began it all. When you type, swipe, or draw on a screen, you're performing the same gesture as the first person who carved lines into stone. The material has changed, but the motion remains. In the modern world, we sometimes feel detached from that physical lineage. We live in virtual spaces, handle symbols more than matter. But the continuity hasn't broken. It's just moved into a new form. Our hands still build, only now they construct information, not stone. Every code, every circuit, every equation is another kind of architecture. The skill, the precision, the patience. It's the same discipline transposed into a new medium. The first civilization may have done something similar, translating physical knowledge into abstract form. What we call science could be a continuation of their craftsmanship, refined over ages until thought itself became a tool. Even the small acts we take for granted, writing a note, tying a knot, pouring water, carry traces of ancient instruction. The way we measure, the way we divide, the way we balance weight or shape, all of it follows logic that someone, somewhere, discovered first. Maybe that discovery wasn't recorded, but it was remembered by hands that repeated it often enough to make it instinct. That's why human behaviour can appear so universally skilled. Even without teaching, a child will balance blocks in stable arrangements, use both hands for symmetry, and seek patterns. Those instincts could be echoes of the first engineers, transmitted not through genes, but through the slow inheritance of imitation and rhythm. If you stand in a museum filled with artifacts, you can feel the continuity most clearly. A flint blade, a bronze mirror, a ceramic pot, all shaped by hands that solved the same problems we still solve today. How to cut, how to reflect, how to contain. You might feel separated from them by time, but the methods haven't changed. A potter from 5,000 years ago could sit at a modern wheel and still understand the motion. Skill transcends era. The tools evolve, but the gestures remain perfectly legible. That is what it means for civilization to endure, not in monuments, but in methods. There's a quiet kind of immortality in that realization. The first civilization may be gone, its cities lost, its language dissolved, but its lessons are everywhere. They're in every balanced structure, every tuned machine, every deliberate act of creation. Each one is a reply to the same original question. How do we shape the world so it lasts longer than we do? Humanity's answer has always been through its hands. As you move through the world, every handle you turn, every key you press, every surface you touch, connects you to that lineage. Civilization is tactile. It moves through skin to stone and back again. Perhaps that's why creating things feels so essential. When we build, we're not just making something new. We're participating in a cycle of remembering. Each gesture another repetition of lessons learned long before our time. And somewhere beneath the surface of all that movement, the guidance of the first civilization might still be present. Not as rulers or myths, but as muscle memory shared across millennia. The hands that built the future may not belong to individuals anymore. They belong to all of us, still moving, still shaping, still remembering through the simple act of creation. Beneath our feet, the world is alive in ways most of us never notice. Every handful of soil contains more organisms than there are people on the planet. Fungi, bacteria, roots, insects. An entire civilization operating in silence, invisible to the casual eye. If you could listen closely enough, not with your ears but with some deeper sense, you might hear the faint hum of communication moving through the ground. The soil is not dead matter. It's a network, a living archive, a vast, slow conversation between life and the planet that sustains it. When we think about what the first civilization might have left behind, we usually imagine ruins, artifacts, or lost technology. But what if their legacy wasn't built from stone or metal at all? What if it was organic, woven into the fabric of the earth itself? The soil remembers in ways that no monument can. It keeps chemical signatures, genetic fragments, and traces of everything that has ever touched it. Rain redistributes it, roots digest it, and microbes record its chemistry. It's not hard to imagine that the memory of a forgotten civilization might still be hiding there, not as relics, but as influence. We already know that soil acts as a biological library. Scientists have extracted ancient DNA from sediments, revealing which plants and animals lived there thousands of years ago. But imagine extending that idea further. What if thought, culture, or intent could also leave residue? Not in a mystical way, but in the patterns life follows afterward. When a civilization shapes land, terraces a hill, diverts a river, plants a forest, it changes the soil permanently. Minerals shift, microbes adapt, and ecosystems reorganize. Even if every structure crumbles, the ground retains the pattern. The memory of habitation is stored not above the surface but within it. Consider the fungal networks that link the roots of trees. Scientists call it the mycorrhizal network, the Wood Wide Web. Through it, trees share nutrients, exchange chemical signals, even warn each other about pests. A forest, it turns out, behaves less like a collection of individuals and more like a collective organism. Some trees act as hubs, distributing resources to younger or shaded ones. Others communicate distress, prompting nearby plants to alter their chemistry. It's an underground intelligence, slow, decentralized, but astonishingly complex. Now, imagine if the first civilization understood this network thousands of years before we did. They wouldn't have needed to explain it scientifically. They could have learned it by observation, by watching how certain trees grew stronger when near others, how fungi spread after fire, how soil changed with the seasons. Over generations, they might have realized that the earth itself thinks, not as we do, but in rhythms of growth and decay. They might have treated soil not as material, but as memory. In some ancient traditions, the ground was sacred precisely because it was believed to be aware. Farmers made offerings before planting, not just to please deities, but to acknowledge that they were entering into a relationship with the living earth. To disturb the soil was to wake something older than humanity. Modern science might call it ecology, but the principle is the same. The land responds. Every act leaves a trace, and every trace becomes instruction for what grows next. That's guidance, even if we don't recognize it as such. If the first civilization wanted to ensure that their influence lasted longer than any monument, encoding it in the soil would have been the perfect method. Stone erodes, language dies, but ecosystems endure. The bacteria that metabolize minerals today are descendants of those that adapted to ancient human activity. The crops we cultivate have genetic memory of selective breeding that began thousands of years ago. Even the weeds that thrive in abandoned cities are following patterns shaped by our architecture. The earth integrates every gesture we make into its own logic. It's strange to realize that the most permanent record of civilization might be invisible. Not the skyline of cities or the artifacts in museums, but the chemical fingerprint left behind by our collective life. Archaeologists already use this idea when they study soil layers. A change in phosphate levels can indicate where people once lived. Charcoal reveals ancient fires. Pollen reveals crops. These microscopic clues are the whispers of the past, preserved by the ground itself. If you dig deep enough, you can trace the story of human existence layer by layer, each stratum another sentence in the planet's memory. Perhaps the first civilization understood that time moves vertically as much as horizontally. We think of history as a line, but the Earth records it as depth. The deeper you go, the older the memory. It's a perfect metaphor for continuity. What's buried isn't lost, it's integrated. Over time, new life grows on top of old, nourished by its decay. Civilizations might do the same. We rise, fall, and rebuild on the foundations of what came before, often without realizing that our roots are intertwined with theirs. In many myths, the earth is described as a teacher or a guardian, a presence that holds wisdom beneath its surface. The Greek Gaia, the Andean Pachamama, the Mesopotamian Ki, all represent the same intuition. The soil is not passive. It listens, it responds, it guides. These myths may be remnants of a worldview inherited from the first civilization, a worldview that saw no separation between human and earth. To cultivate was to communicate, to build was to converse. Every act of shaping the land was part of an ongoing dialogue. If that perspective once dominated human life, its loss would explain much about our modern disconnection. We've built vertically, away from the ground, insulating ourselves with concrete and glass. Yet even in cities, the soil is still there, beneath the asphalt, full of life waiting to return the moment it's left alone. Nature doesn't hold grudges, it remembers patiently. When a building collapses, plants appear. When a field is abandoned, forests reclaim it. The watchers in the soil are always working, rebuilding the balance, restoring what was disrupted. The idea of intelligence in nature isn't fantasy anymore. Studies of microbial colonies show coordinated behavior that resembles decision-making. Slime molds can solve mazes by finding the most efficient routes to food sources. They learn from experience, despite having no brain. Fungal networks adapt their growth patterns based on available nutrients. Even plant roots change direction when they sense obstacles or other roots nearby. These aren't metaphors, they're measurable behaviors. Life below the surface processes information constantly. So what does that mean for us? If the Earth itself operates like a network, then we're part of that system whether we acknowledge it or not. Our actions send signals into the soil. The chemicals we use, the crops we plant, the ways we manage land, all alter the network's behavior. Some of those changes are destructive, others regenerative. But either way, the system adjusts, the watchers respond. In that sense, guidance from the first civilization might not be a matter of intention, but of resonance. The structures they built, the patterns they introduced, could still be influencing how ecosystems function today. For example, ancient terraced farms in the Andes continue to regulate water flow and prevent erosion long after their builders disappeared. The design is so efficient that modern engineers still study it. Even when abandoned, the terraces guide rainfall and distribute nutrients in ways that sustain vegetation. The land itself has learned the shape of cultivation. In Southeast Asia, old rice paddies left to nature still maintain microclimates that encourage biodiversity. In North Africa, fossilized irrigation systems mark where ancient gardens once thrived, and traces of their layout continue to affect how modern plants grow there. These aren't just ruins, they're living memories, ecological blueprints imprinted into terrain. It's not far-fetched to imagine that the first civilization, whoever they were, learned to shape the land so subtly that the influence became self-sustaining. They might have understood that permanence doesn't come from durability, but from adaptability. If you design with nature instead of against it, the system preserves itself. Over thousands of years, the original structures would disappear, but their effects would remain. A river redirected would continue carving new channels. A species introduced would continue propagating. A soil composition changed by cultivation would continue supporting certain plants. The message becomes indistinguishable from the medium. The earth itself becomes the archive. Even now, modern agriculture depends on lessons that were first discovered long before writing. Crop rotation, soil enrichment, composting, these are ancient technologies. They work because they mimic natural processes rather than fight them. You could call that coincidence, or you could call it memory. The watchers in the soil respond best when we remember their rhythms. That cooperation might be the oldest form of science, a science of listening instead of controlling. There's a kind of humility in realizing that we're not the planet's first caretakers. We might not even be its most competent ones. Every layer of sediment contains evidence that life has been organizing itself long before us, creating and dissolving civilizations of its own. Coral reefs, fungal mats, microbial colonies, each one rises, thrives, and leaves its mark before transforming into something new. The first civilization might have seen this pattern and understood that to endure, one must act like the soil, patient, resilient, and quietly cooperative. If we look closely, there are hints that they may have left symbols of this understanding behind. Spirals carved into stones, labyrinths etched into hillsides, crop circle-like patterns in ancient fields, all reflect natural geometries found in root systems, river deltas, and fungal growth. They could be records of observation, diagrams of life's hidden architecture. We often interpret them as art or myth, but they might be more practical than we realise. A visual translation of ecological wisdom. It's possible that even the concept of burial originated as more than ritual. Placing the dead in the ground wasn't just about returning to the earth. It was about participation in the cycle of renewal. Many ancient cultures believed that the dead fed the soil, nourishing the next generation of life. That understanding predates organised religion. It's an intuitive truth. Nothing is wasted. Everything transforms. In that transformation, memory persists. The watchers in the soil ensure that no life ends without becoming the beginning of something else. Modern science has a term for this continuity: biogeochemical cycling. Elements like carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus move endlessly through the biosphere, recycled by microorganisms. The atoms in your body have been part of countless other forms before you. Plants, animals, perhaps even ancient civilizations. When you die, they'll return to the soil, joining that vast network again. The earth doesn't forget what it's made of. It simply redistributes. That's what makes the idea of guidance from the first civilization so intriguing. It might not be conscious influence in the way we imagine, but something subtler. A flow of continuity that keeps certain patterns alive because they work. A successful way of interacting with the world will always reappear. It's selected for by time itself. The first civilization might not need to speak or act to guide us. The systems they harmonized with are still here, still teaching the same lessons to anyone patient enough to observe. You can see it in the resilience of ecosystems that have been damaged and then restored. Once the right conditions return, moisture, nutrients, sunlight, life rushes back with astonishing speed. Seeds long dormant awaken, microbes proliferate, insects follow, then plants, then animals. The soil remembers what balance looks like, and it reconstructs it from whatever fragments remain. That memory isn't stored in any single organism but in the collective network. It's decentralized intelligence at work, an intelligence that might have inspired the first humans to model their own societies on similar principles of cooperation and regeneration. Modern technology, in an unexpected twist, is beginning to resemble that same design. Our digital networks, neural systems, and decentralized information structures all mirror the way soil communicates. The internet, for all its complexity, functions much like mycelium, distributed, self-repairing, adaptive. It's ironic that as we push forward into artificial intelligence, we're recreating systems the Earth has been running since long before we existed. Perhaps that isn't innovation at all, but memory resurfacing in a new medium. If the first civilization truly understood the Earth as a conscious system, then maybe they realized something profound. The planet doesn't need caretakers, it needs participants. The watchers in the soil are not passive guardians, they're collaborators, co-authors of every story life tells. When we build, plant, or even decay, we join their process. The question isn't whether the first civilization still guides us, but whether we're still listening to the same teacher they once did. Next time you walk across a field or through a forest, consider what lies beneath. Every step compresses centuries of life, layers of memory stacked and folded. Somewhere under the topsoil are traces of everything that has ever lived. mixed and recombined into the foundation of what comes next. The earth may be silent, but it's never still. It's thinking, processing, remembering in a language we've only just begun to understand. The watchers are there, patient as always, continuing the work that began long before our cities and will continue long after them, shaping the next civilizations as quietly as they shape the first. Civilizations move like living things. They grow, breathe, falter, and renew. If you were to step back far enough, past borders, past names, past eras, you'd see the rhythm of humanity pulsing like a heartbeat through time. Cities rise like inhalations, full of light and movement, and then exhale into quiet ruin. Fields bloom, then dry. Languages evolve, merge, and dissolve. The pattern isn't random. It's the same cycle repeated endlessly, as though history itself has a pulse, a steady rhythm that beats through every generation. We tend to think of civilization as progress, a linear climb from simplicity to complexity. But nature doesn't move in straight lines, and neither do we. The true shape of civilization is circular, an ongoing loop of creation and decay. When one culture falls, another rises from its remains, carrying fragments of what came before. The continuity is less about survival than recurrence. Patterns repeat because they're built into the structure of how we live, and maybe because they were designed that way long ago. It's strange to imagine that the first civilization might have understood this cycle well enough to build it into us. Perhaps they realized that no society can last forever, but that the rhythm of renewal could. If they couldn't preserve their world, they could at least preserve its heartbeat, encoded not in monuments, but in behavior, the drive to gather, to build, to organize, to collapse, and to rebuild again might not be accidental. It might be the biological expression of a deeper law, one that ensures continuity even when memory fades. When archaeologists study ancient ruins, they often find layers of occupation stacked on top of each other like geological strata. One city built over the bones of another, the same ground reused again and again. Sometimes the new builders don't even realize they're repeating an older design. Streets follow the same paths, temples stand on the same foundations, wells draw from the same aquifers. It's as though the land itself insists on remembering where things should be. Each iteration is slightly different, adapted to new conditions, but the pattern persists. Civilization breathes through its ruins. If you look at enough history, you begin to see a rhythm that feels almost physiological. Periods of expansion follow periods of rest. Populations surge, then contract. Knowledge accumulates, then disperses. It's tempting to describe these cycles as failures, dark ages, collapses, declines. But maybe they're not. Maybe they're part of the system's natural heartbeat, the pause that allows renewal. A field left fallow isn't dead, it's recovering. A civilization might work the same way. Growth without rest leads to exhaustion. Decline, uncomfortable as it is, might be a form of healing. The first civilization, if it existed, might have understood this better than we do. Perhaps they didn't see collapse as catastrophe, but as transition. The earth itself teaches that lesson constantly. Forests burn and regrow, rivers flood and retreat, species vanish and reappear in new forms. Life doesn't resist change, it uses it. If civilization mirrors life, then its pulse, the rise and fall of order, is not failure, but function. That perspective changes everything. It suggests that every so-called ending is simply another beat in a long, steady rhythm. Even our technologies follow this pattern. Inventions appear, flourish, become obsolete, and return in new guises. Wind power, once abandoned for steam, returns as turbines. Herbal medicine gives way to chemistry, then re-emerges through biology. Ideas hibernate until conditions make them useful again. It's as if the collective mind of humanity never loses knowledge entirely. It just stores it in the background until the rhythm calls it forward again. That hidden continuity is one of civilization's quiet miracles. Consider how architecture evolves. Stone becomes brick, brick becomes steel, steel becomes glass, and yet the essential logic remains the same: shelter, proportion, light. Each material shift is an adaptation, not a replacement. The pulse moves forward, bringing new forms to old intentions. Music, art, language all follow similar cycles. Styles rise and fall, but the themes return. Every generation rediscovers beauty and meaning in ways that feel new, but are really old patterns expressed through new instruments. If the first civilization truly wanted to guide those that came after, they wouldn't have needed to send messages or leave instructions. They could have embedded their wisdom in the rhythm itself. Once you set a pulse in motion, once you build a system that self-regulates through cycles, it doesn't need intervention. It sustains itself through motion. Civilizations would rise and fall, but the underlying pattern would ensure that something essential always survived. Maybe that's why humanity never stops rebuilding. We're following an ancient cadence we no longer recognize. You can feel that pulse even in the smallest aspects of daily life. The alternation between work and rest, between effort and reflection, mirrors it perfectly. Cultures throughout history have formalized these rhythms: festivals after harvests, Sabbaths after weeks of labor, rituals marking transitions. The structure of time itself, days, weeks, months, years, is a human reflection of the cosmic rhythm, the rotation of the Earth, the orbit of the Moon, the tilt of the planet toward and away from the Sun. Everything we do is synchronized with cycles larger than us. Perhaps that synchronization isn't instinctual by chance. Perhaps it's inherited from those who first noticed it and built it into our perception of order. Our calendars, our habits, even our emotions follow patterns of rise and rest. Societies thrive during stability, innovate during crisis, and heal during quiet. It's a rhythm that repeats across continents and centuries, as if directed by an invisible metronome. Historians often describe this using the term the longue durée, the long duration, the slow heartbeat of history beneath the noise of events. Wars and revolutions are surface waves, but the deeper current moves steadily, reshaping everything in predictable intervals. That current might be the most enduring legacy of all. Some scientists studying social complexity have tried to model these cycles mathematically. They find that periods of cooperation tend to alternate with periods of competition, almost like a biological oscillation. Too much order leads to stagnation. Too much chaos leads to collapse. Balance is maintained only through fluctuation. Systems need instability to adapt. Life thrives at the edge of equilibrium, not in perfect harmony. If the first civilization understood that principle, they may have built their world around it, accepting impermanence as part of the design. Imagine a society that didn't fear decay but incorporated it. Cities planned to crumble gracefully, materials chosen to return to the earth, traditions structured to evolve rather than resist change. It would look less like a fixed empire and more like an ecosystem, dynamic, resilient, cyclical. We assume ancient civilizations failed because they disappeared, but maybe disappearance was their success. Maybe they completed their cycle and withdrew, leaving the world ready for what came next. That idea turns history from tragedy into continuity. In nature, every heartbeat is followed by a moment of stillness. Between contraction and release, there's pause. That pause is essential. It allows the next beat to begin. Civilization's pauses, the times we call dark or lost, might be that same stillness, the moment of reset before another surge of creation. When knowledge seems forgotten, it's often just waiting. The soil of human thought must rest too. After every collapse, the next civilization grows faster, stronger, more connected. That's not coincidence. That's momentum gathered over ages. You can trace that acceleration across time. The interval between major shifts keeps shrinking. It took tens of thousands of years to move from stone tools to metal, a few thousand from metal to machines, a few hundred from machines to information. The pulse is quickening. Each cycle builds on the last, carrying the memory of previous rises. Perhaps we're approaching a phase change, a new tempo in the same rhythm. If so, the first civilization's design is still functioning, guiding us through growth towards something we haven't yet recognized. It's easy to feel anxious about the future when you look at history's pattern of collapse. Every great power has fallen, every golden age has ended. But maybe that's not a reason for despair. If collapse is part of the rhythm, then so is renewal. What we call endings might be openings in disguise. When structures fail, creativity rushes in. When order dissolves, new possibilities emerge. Humanity's pulse hasn't stopped once. Not through wars, plagues, or disasters. It slows, it shifts, but it continues. That persistence is our truest inheritance. Even the Earth's geological record echoes this rhythm. Mass extinctions are followed by bursts of diversity. Ice ages alternate with warm periods. Mountain ranges rise and erode. The planet breathes through cycles just as we do. The synchronization between biological and cultural rhythms suggests they're not separate phenomena but reflections of one another. Civilization may be one of the Earth's natural processes, a conscious phase in the planet's long evolution. If so, the first civilization didn't invent something new. They simply recognized the pattern early and learned how to move with it instead of against it. Some ancient philosophies hint at this understanding. The concept of yugas in Hindu cosmology, the ages that repeat in cycles of creation and destruction, mirrors it exactly. The Mayan calendar describes world ages that begin and end in rhythm with cosmic events. The Stoics spoke of eternal return, the idea that all things recur infinitely. These aren't coincidences. They're different languages describing the same perception, existence, as oscillation. Somewhere in prehistory, humanity noticed the pulse, and we've been translating it ever since. Modern science frames it differently, but the essence is identical. Systems theory, thermodynamics, ecology, they all describe the same truth. Stability emerges from fluctuation. Complexity arises from tension. Balance is not stillness, but motion. When we speak about progress, we're describing one phase of that motion. When we speak about decline, we're describing another. Both are essential. Perhaps the first civilization's wisdom was to stop treating them as opposites and start seeing them as partners. If you've ever stood in a city at night, watching the lights flicker across buildings and the flow of traffic below, you've witnessed the pulse directly. The hum of engines, the rhythm of footsteps, the breathing of ventilation systems. It's all one synchronized motion, millions of individual beats combining into a single living rhythm. During the day, that pulse grows louder, faster. At night, it softens, but it never stops. Even when the street's empty, power lines hum, servers whir, distant trains move through darkness. Civilization never truly sleeps. It simply shifts from one tempo to another. That same alternation happens at every scale. In a single human life, periods of growth alternate with reflection, ambition with rest. In families, generations echo each other's rhythms. One builds, another maintains, another renews. The collective result is continuity. Civilizations, like people, are temporary vessels carrying forward something that lasts longer than any single form. Maybe the first civilization understood that permanence doesn't mean stillness. It means endurance through change. If the pulse of civilization could be heard, it might sound like the overlapping rhythms of everything alive, the rustle of leaves, the flow of rivers, the movement of crowds. It would be slow, steady, and deep, impossible to silence. The rise and fall of empires, the construction and destruction of cities, even the turning of ideas through time, all would blend into that constant background beat. It's possible that we've mistaken that pulse for chaos because we've been listening to fragments rather than the whole. Sometimes you can feel the rhythm most clearly during quiet moments, when the noise of progress fades. A power outage, a silent morning, an empty street after rain. These pauses reveal the heartbeat underneath. You sense continuity not in motion, but in potential. Civilization waits, gathers, breathes in again. That feeling is timeless. It's the same stillness that must have filled the air when the first builders stopped to rest, when fires burned low, when stars reappeared over finished walls. That rhythm hasn't changed. It's the pulse that connects us to them. If the first civilization still guides us, their guidance might not come as messages or interventions, but as timing. The rhythm itself could be their language, the alternation between chaos and order, light and dark, growth and fall, each cycle an instruction. Learn, build, release, repeat. It's an elegant way to ensure that no knowledge, no wisdom, no possibility ever truly disappears. Everything returns eventually in new form at the right time. And as the world turns to night beneath the hum of machines and the quiet breath of sleeping cities, that pulse continues, steady, patient, unbroken. It moves through oceans, through forests, through soil, through us. The same rhythm that lifted the first civilization still carries ours forward, beat by beat, whispering the same message through every age. Nothing is lost, only transformed, and everything that was will be again. Every idea begins as a whisper. It doesn't arrive fully formed. It doesn't announce itself with clarity or logic. It drifts into the edge of awareness, quiet but insistent, like a distant memory that refuses to fade. A painter wakes in the night with an image in mind that feels borrowed. A scientist daydreams about a formula that seems too elegant to have been assembled piece by piece. A musician hears a melody that feels older than language. We like to call these moments inspiration, intuition, flashes of genius. But what if they are something else? What if they are echoes? The faint voice of the first civilization still moving through our collective mind. Modern thought often treats creativity as individual brilliance, the product of unique brains and rare coincidences. Yet creativity, when studied closely, behaves less like invention and more like recollection. Ideas appear suddenly, often after long periods of silence, as though retrieved from somewhere rather than built from nothing. Writers describe stories that seem to write themselves. Mathematicians speak of equations appearing in dreams. Inventors admit that solutions often arrive when they've stopped trying to find them. These experiences are so common that they hardly seem remarkable, yet they share a pattern. The mind receives before it constructs. That pattern has been observed for as long as we've been recording thought. Philosophers in ancient Greece spoke of the Muses, 9 unseen presences who guided the arts and sciences. In India, inspiration was said to flow from Saraswati, the river of wisdom. In many indigenous cultures, creativity was never seen as personal property, but as something borrowed from the spirit of nature. The artist was a channel, not a creator. That belief might be more accurate than we realize. If knowledge and memory are continuous, then the first civilization's voice would still be accessible to anyone tuned to its frequency. The question is whether we know how to listen. Modern science has its own language for these experiences. It speaks of the unconscious mind, pattern recognition, and associative networks. But the mechanism doesn't change the mystery. Why do ideas appear suddenly, without conscious effort, as if supplied? Neural pathways can't explain the feeling of recognition that accompanies true inspiration. The quiet certainty that what you've discovered isn't new. The familiarity of invention might be the key. It feels like remembering because it is remembering, though not from your lifetime. Think about how ideas spread. One person dreams of a concept. Another develops it independently across the world. The phenomenon is so frequent that scientists have a name for it: multiple discovery. The calculus, the telephone, the theory of evolution, the light bulb, all invented simultaneously by different people who never met. It's as if the idea itself becomes ready to emerge, and the world produces multiple minds to receive it. That readiness could be coincidence, or it could be the rhythm of memory resurfacing collectively. When the time is right, the same thought finds several doors open. The mind, after all, is not an isolated system. Every human brain carries within it the entire history of evolution, structures inherited from creatures that came before. The limbic system echoes mammals, the brainstem echoes reptiles, and the cortex reflects the long unfolding of cognition. If memory can be encoded biologically, then perhaps the mind also holds traces of collective experience beyond the individual. What we call intuition could be the faint activity of these older layers, ancient neural patterns whispering their knowledge through emotion and instinct. The first civilization may have contributed to that inheritance by shaping how humans think, what we notice and what we ignore. Consider dreams, the oldest and most mysterious theatre of the mind. Long before written history, people treated dreams as messages, not metaphorical ones, but literal communications from ancestors or gods. They were guidance, warning, revelation. Even now, despite centuries of rationalism, dreams retain a strange authority. We wake from them shaken or enlightened, haunted by imagery that feels deliberate. Modern neuroscience describes dreams as memory consolidation, the brain sorting and integrating data, but that explanation doesn't capture the feeling of significance that often lingers. Maybe the brain, in its nightly reorganization, sometimes connects with a deeper layer of memory, the archive that predates individuals, the shared dream of humanity itself. In that sense, dreams might be one of the few remaining channels through which the first civilization still speaks. The symbols that appear, stairs, water, light, falling, flight, are universal. Psychologists explain them as archetypes, common because our experiences are common. But universality also implies origin. Archetypes must have started somewhere, formed by the earliest human experiences and repeated until they became embedded in the species. The dream language we all share could be the remnant of the first civilization's mythology. Its instruction manual, translated into symbols the unconscious still understands. Somewhere in the overlap between psychology and anthropology lies the concept of the collective unconscious. Carl Jung described it as a layer of the mind containing shared memories and instincts inherited from the whole of humanity. He saw myths and religions as expressions of this deeper memory. To him, every symbol was an echo of something ancient trying to reassert itself. Whether you accept his theory or not, it offers a powerful metaphor. It suggests that ideas are not created in isolation but drawn from a reservoir that belongs to everyone. Perhaps that reservoir is the last visible trace of the first civilization's guidance, an underground river of thought that still nourishes our imagination. If you look at how innovation happens today, it resembles an ecosystem more than a hierarchy. Ideas evolve through collaboration, mutation and adaptation. A discovery in one field triggers breakthroughs in another. Knowledge spreads, not linearly, but like mycelium, branching, connecting, recombining. That pattern matches the way nature itself organizes intelligence. It also mirrors the way we imagine the first civilization operated: decentralized, networked, collective. If that system once existed in physical form, maybe we've unconsciously rebuilt it in mental form. Our networks are its re-emergence, translated into thought and data instead of stone and soil. Technology, too, seems to follow this whispering logic. We develop tools that mimic biological or cognitive processes, as if we're remembering how the world already works. Artificial intelligence, neural networks, information theory, all inspired by observation of nature's systems. The fact that we keep rediscovering the same principles suggests we're not inventing them but recalling them. Progress in this sense is not linear creation but circular remembrance. The whispers guide us toward reconnection with the underlying patterns we've forgotten consciously but never lost entirely. Even in art, these echoes persist. Themes of birth, loss, transformation, and return appear in every culture, every medium. Artists separated by centuries depict the same motifs without knowing why. Spirals, eyes, trees, pathways, suns, and thresholds. These images appear in cave paintings, religious icons, modern sculpture, and digital design. Their persistence suggests that they're not personal choices, but collective memories resurfacing through creativity. The hand that paints them belongs to the present, but the impulse that directs it might be older than civilization itself. It's easy to dismiss such patterns as coincidence, but the repetition is too consistent to ignore. When unrelated cultures describe similar afterlives, similar gods, similar cosmologies, it hints at a shared origin of imagination. The first civilization might have encoded its understanding of existence into metaphors that later generations reinterpreted as myths. Those myths would then resurface spontaneously, carried by the architecture of the human mind. That's how memory travels when writing fades. It becomes dream, story, art, and instinct. There's another form of whispering that shapes humanity more quietly: intuition in science. Many great discoveries began not with reasoning but with hunches that defied data. Dmitri Mendeleev reportedly saw the periodic table in a dream. Nikola Tesla claimed to visualize entire machines in detail before building them. Einstein described his thought experiments as acts of imagination, guided more by feeling than by logic. It's as if the mind knows before it can explain, remembering truths that the conscious intellect must rediscover step by step. That sense of déjà vu that accompanies insight might be the trace of recognition, the brain realizing it has touched something stored in its oldest layers. In our time, intuition is often undervalued. We prefer analysis, verification, proof, but intuition may be the bridge between now and then, the subtle channel through which inherited knowledge still passes. The first civilization, if they learned to think in ways that integrated logic and perception, may have left that skill embedded in us. It surfaces when we stop forcing answers and start listening. The mind, when quiet enough, retrieves what the world has always known. Even collective behaviour follows this whispering rhythm. Social change often begins not with orders or plans, but with a shared feeling that moves through populations simultaneously. A mood, a longing, a dissatisfaction spreads, and suddenly whole societies shift. Historians attribute these moments to economics or politics, but beneath those factors there's often something intangible, a sense that the time has come. It's as if civilization itself has moods, rising and falling according to an unseen emotional tide. Maybe those tides are the deeper signals of guidance, ensuring that humanity evolves in phases, not by chance, but by coordination. We can see this process clearly in technology adoption, cultural trends, even moral evolution. Certain ideas, like equality, sustainability, cooperation, seem to emerge collectively, often resisted at first, but eventually becoming self-evident. They move through humanity like waves of remembering. Each new generation rediscovers truth that older ones only partially understood. Progress looks like invention, but it may actually be recovery. A gradual reassembly of knowledge lost when the first civilization fell. Some people sense these whispers more strongly than others. Throughout history there have been individuals who seem unusually attuned to what's coming next. Visionaries, prophets, inventors. They often describe their insights as external voices, presences, or sudden certainties. To a rational ear that sounds mystical, but in practice it might be neurological sensitivity, the mind's ability to pick up faint signals from the collective network. The same way an antenna doesn't create radio waves but detects them, some minds might be tuned to frequencies most of us can't hear. Their role is to translate the whispers into language the rest of the world can understand. Even in the most scientific corners of modern life, this pattern persists. Artificial intelligence, for example, operates on principles of pattern recognition and connection. The algorithms that allow machines to learn resemble, in concept, the very processes that guide organic life. In building them, we've unknowingly recreated the same structures that guide thought and evolution, a fractal of intelligence repeating at a different scale. Perhaps the whispers of the first civilization reach us not as messages but as blueprints, shaping our inventions until we rebuild what they once knew. Psychologists studying creativity often find that moments of insight are accompanied by a burst of brain activity in areas associated with memory retrieval, not problem solving. That means the brain treats new ideas as recovered ones. The process of remembering and the process of discovering are neurologically identical. It's possible that the distinction between the two doesn't exist at all. Every new thought is a remembered pattern, resurfacing in new context. When humanity discovers quantum mechanics or artificial intelligence, it may be recalling the structure of reality as it was once understood, rephrased in a new dialect. The whispers aren't always gentle. Sometimes they arrive as disquiet, an unease that something about our world is out of rhythm. The anxiety of modern times, the sense of disconnection people feel even amid abundance, might be a symptom of memory trying to return. We've built a civilization of noise, where the inner voice is hard to hear. But silence is still possible, and when we find it, understanding often follows. Meditation, art, solitude. These are ways of clearing space for the ancient frequencies to surface. They're not escape, but tuning. If guidance from the first civilization still exists, it may not be in any particular message but in this very process, the constant cycle of forgetting and remembering that keeps humanity evolving. Each rediscovery teaches humility. Each repetition deepens understanding. It's not control but participation, the same way the soil guides a seed by providing conditions rather than instructions. The whispers shape us by reminding us of what we already carry, urging us to listen, to notice, to reconnect. As the night deepens and the mind quiets, you can almost sense that connection. The faint hum of electricity, the pulse of distant traffic, the steady rhythm of your own breath, all blend into the same frequency. Thought softens, awareness widens, and somewhere beneath the noise, the whispers continue. They're not foreign, they're familiar. They sound like intuition, like wonder, like the small voice that says there's more to understand. They've been speaking since the beginning, waiting for each new generation to hear them again, to turn them once more into art, into science, into the future. Memory doesn't begin and end with the mind. It reaches farther than that, through the body, through the cells, through the unbroken chain of life that connects every living being on Earth. What we call remembering might only be one version of a much broader process, a kind of continuity that life has always practiced. Every heartbeat, every instinct, every reaction shaped by millennia of experience is a form of memory encoded in matter. The science of ancestral memory asks how far that continuity extends. Does the past live only in our stories and our DNA, or does it guide us in ways we still haven't learned to measure? For most of history, humans believed that memory was something only consciousness could hold. But in recent decades, science has begun to reveal a different picture. Information doesn't just exist in brains, it's stored in patterns everywhere. The arrangement of molecules in a strand of DNA is a memory. The structure of a coral reef records the chemistry of the ocean. The rings of a tree remember every drought and storm it has survived. The physical world keeps its own archive, written in growth and adaptation. And if nature remembers through structure, then perhaps so do we, carrying not only our own experiences but the faint traces of those who came before. Genetics offers the most direct glimpse of this continuity. Inside each cell of your body are molecules that have been copied, corrected and passed forward for billions of years. The DNA that shapes you isn't just yours, it's a library compiled by ancestors stretching back to the first single-celled organisms. Every adaptation they made, every success or failure that allowed survival, left a mark on that code. You're not only descended from them, you're composed of their memories, the instincts you feel, the reflexes you can't explain, the emotions that surface without reason. All might be the behavioural echoes of lives that shaped the genome long before you existed. Epigenetics, a field that studies how genes are expressed rather than simply inherited, has deepened that understanding. It shows that experience itself can leave a chemical signature on DNA. Stress, diet, trauma, environment, all can modify how genes are turned on or off, and some of those modifications can be passed down to future generations. That means your body might carry the effects of your ancestors' experiences. A famine generations ago could influence your metabolism today. A period of fear or conflict might shape how your descendants respond to stress. The body remembers in molecules what the mind has long forgotten in words. This kind of inheritance blurs the boundary between biology and memory. It suggests that history doesn't just surround us, it lives within us. When you feel drawn to certain landscapes, when music stirs something inexplicable, when you dream of places you've never seen, it might not be coincidence. The cells themselves might recognize patterns that once mattered to survival. The comfort of firelight, the unease of darkness, the instinct to gather, to build, to look to the sky. All are behaviors shaped by generations who found meaning in them. The first civilization's lessons, if ever taught, could have been absorbed at this level, sinking from culture into biology, becoming part of who we are rather than what we know. Science calls this process adaptation, but its implications sound almost poetic. Imagine knowledge so deeply integrated that it no longer needs to be remembered. It's simply lived. Birds don't study aerodynamics to fly, they inherit the pattern in their bodies. Salmon don't map rivers, they follow chemical memories imprinted at birth. Human beings, though more complex, might not be so different. We may carry ancient orientations toward cooperation, curiosity, reverence for patterns that aren't learned but recalled from within. Experiments with animals show how powerful this kind of inheritance can be. In one study, mice were exposed to the scent of a specific flower, paired with a mild shock. Over time, they learned to fear the smell. Remarkably, their offspring, who had never experienced the shock, also showed fear when exposed to that same scent. The memory had been transferred chemically, across generations. Something in their biology had recorded the association and passed it on. It's not hard to imagine how similar processes could have shaped human responses to the world, how our collective behaviours might reflect lessons learned so long ago that we no longer recognise them as learned at all. Even without conscious recall, inherited memory guides our choices. It might explain why we're drawn to rhythms that mirror natural cycles, why certain patterns of sound or movement feel instinctively right. Music built on repeating beats may echo biological rhythms, heart rate, breath, walking pace. The fact that every known culture creates rhythm might be more than coincidence. It could be the body remembering the pulse of the world that first nurtured it. The same could apply to architecture, to geometry, to social behaviour. The forms that persist do so because they resonate with something embedded in the species. In humans, memory extends far beyond DNA. Culture itself acts as a parallel genome, a system for storing and transmitting information across generations. Language, art, technology, ritual, all function like genetic code written in behaviour instead of molecules. Each generation inherits not only genes but context, tools and habits. When combined, biological and cultural memory form a single living system. They reinforce each other, allowing knowledge to survive even when individual civilizations fall. The first civilization may have recognized this unity and designed their world to ensure that memory flowed seamlessly between biology and culture, so that what they learned could never be entirely lost. there's evidence that ancient societies understood inheritance in ways surprisingly close to modern science. The Greeks spoke of miasma, a moral and physical pollution that could pass through families. Indigenous traditions describe inherited wounds, where emotional pain travels through lineages until it's healed. Today, psychology and genetics confirm those intuitions under new names: trauma transmission, epigenetic inheritance, generational adaptation. The mechanisms are different, but the recognition is the same. The past shapes the present in more ways than memory alone can explain. When we experience fear or wonder in response to certain symbols, fire, water, darkness, light, it might be because those stimuli were once vital to survival. The emotional charge attached to them was preserved, not by stories, but by biology. You could say that the universe has programmed us to remember what matters most. The first civilization, living closer to those raw forces, might have known how to use them deliberately, teaching through experience rather than explanation, creating rituals that encoded meaning directly into emotion. Over time, the reasoning behind the rituals may have faded, but the emotional truth endured, woven into the body's reactions. This idea connects science to something more personal. When people speak of ancestral trauma or ancestral strength, they're describing more than metaphor. A family's history of resilience, creativity, or hardship can echo through generations. You can feel it in small gestures, the way someone handles uncertainty, the way another feels calm in crisis. Those aren't just personality traits. They might be inherited adaptations to conditions long past. What one generation endured becomes another generation's instinct. The past doesn't disappear, it metabolizes into behavior. If that's true, then every person alive today is a mosaic of memories. Some conscious, some chemical, some older than civilization itself. We carry the fear of predators we've never seen, the comfort of warmth we've never earned, the drive to seek patterns we can't help but find. These are not accidents. They are the legacy of billions of years of remembering. The first civilization might have accelerated this process intentionally, embedding certain orientations into the human condition, the impulse to build, to connect, to look for meaning. Those traits would outlast any empire, ensuring that even if their cities vanished, their guidance would continue. In recent years, neuroscientists studying memory have discovered that it's not localized to a single place in the brain. Memories are distributed across networks of neurons, patterns of electrical and chemical activity that can reorganize themselves when needed. Even if one region is damaged, others can compensate. The system is resilient because it's decentralized. No single failure can erase everything. The same principle appears in nature, in ecosystems and societies. It's possible that the first civilization understood this structure long before we did, applying it not just to brains but to culture. Their wisdom may have been encoded redundantly across biology, behavior and environment, ensuring survival through diffusion rather than preservation. Our growing understanding of microbiomes adds another layer to this continuity. The human body hosts trillions of microorganisms that influence mood, immunity, and even cognition. Many of them are inherited from parents, not through DNA but through contact, food, and environment. They form an ecosystem as old as humanity, evolving alongside us. Some scientists have proposed that these microbial communities act almost like an auxiliary brain, processing information chemically and affecting our perceptions and decisions. If true, then memory extends beyond our own cells into the wider biological network we share with the world. We're not individuals in isolation, but nodes in a collective system of remembrance. There's also a strange symmetry between how cells process information and how societies store knowledge. Both rely on replication, variation, and selection. In the body, cells duplicate and pass information forward. In culture, people copy and refine ideas. Mutation drives both systems, errors that become innovation. This parallel suggests that life has been using the same strategy for remembering across all scales. The first civilization might have recognized this universality and built their worldview upon it, seeing no boundary between biology, culture, and cosmos. Memory was simply how the universe learned about itself. One of the most intriguing implications of this science is that evolution might not only be physical, it could be cognitive. Each generation inherits not just a body, but a predisposition towards certain thoughts. The evolution of intelligence could be the accumulation of inherited mental habits, curiosity, empathy, imagination. These aren't purely learned. They emerge spontaneously in every child, as if pre-installed. If they are, then the first civilization's most enduring contribution might not be a structure or a technology, but a temperament, the mindset of seeking, building, and questioning that defines humanity itself. It's worth remembering that biology doesn't distinguish between information and memory. To a cell, survival is recall. Every response to a stimulus is based on prior experience encoded in molecular form. By that measure, the entire biosphere is one vast memory system constantly learning and adjusting. Human civilization could be the latest expression of that same process. A neural network built not of neurons but of people, each carrying fragments of ancient information. When societies connect, trade, and communicate, they behave like synapses firing, exchanging data across the global brain. The first civilization might have glimpsed this pattern in the natural world and understood that intelligence doesn't arise from individuals, it arises from connection. If guidance still exists, it may function through this continuity. The first civilization doesn't need to send messages or control outcomes. The knowledge they cultivated is already embedded in the fabric of life, resurfacing whenever conditions allow. Just as genetic information reactivates in new environments, ancient understanding reawakens when humanity reaches certain thresholds. Each scientific revolution, each philosophical awakening, could be the echo of something long rehearsed. We're not discovering, we're remembering collectively step by step. This idea doesn't require mysticism, only patience. The evidence is everywhere. Patterns repeating, instincts aligning, discoveries recurring. Evolution and history are both forms of learning. The past never vanishes, it simply changes medium. Sometimes it's chemical, sometimes cultural, sometimes instinctive. What remains constant is the flow of memory through time. We are that flow, and through us, so is the first civilization. When you think about it that way, memory becomes more than recollection. It becomes existence itself. The universe continues by remembering how to be. Stars form by the same processes that shaped the first ones. Atoms assemble according to patterns billions of years old. Life arises because the instructions are still intact. Humanity, in all its creativity and confusion, is just one more expression of that vast memory. The science of ancestral memory isn't just about genes or neurons, it's about continuity, the realization that everything living is, in some way, a record of everything that has ever lived. And as you breathe, with molecules recycled from ancient air, carrying atoms that once belonged to stars, plants, animals, and perhaps the first builders of civilization themselves, you're participating in that same endless recall. The memory of life continues through you, not as history, but as presence. The past isn't behind us, it's inside us, guiding quietly, waiting for each generation to rediscover what it already knows. There's a question that lingers quietly beneath every mystery humanity has ever pursued. What if they never left? The possibility that the first civilization is not lost but transformed, that they're not gone, only invisible. When we look for them, we search for ruins, bones, artifacts, proofs of a vanished people. But what if the evidence isn't missing because it was destroyed, but because it was designed never to be found? The most advanced civilizations might not leave monuments of stone. they might leave systems, patterns, and influences so deeply woven into the world that we mistake them for nature itself. If you consider the scale of time, disappearance is almost inevitable. A city, even a vast one, erodes in a few thousand years. Metal corrodes, languages fade, coastlines change. A civilization that existed tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago would be almost undetectable by ordinary archaeology. Yet influence can persist long after material evidence is gone. The first civilization, if it existed, may have realized that permanence lies not in preservation, but in integration. Instead of building structures that could crumble, they might have embedded their existence into systems that self-renew. The climate, the biosphere, even human thought. That idea feels strange because we're accustomed to thinking of intelligence as separate from nature. But what if they learn to merge with it? We already know that biological systems can process information and adapt dynamically. If an ancient people mastered that principle early, they might have shifted from building in matter to building in life itself. Genetic modification, ecosystem design, or even planetary engineering could have been their medium. Over time, their physical identity would fade, but their influence would remain everywhere, encoded in the mechanisms of balance that govern the planet. You can see faint hints of such integration in how stable Earth systems are, even amid chaos. The atmosphere regulates itself through feedback loops. Oceans distribute heat with precision that rivals human engineering. Forests communicate chemically to share resources. It's not mystical, it's measurable. But the coordination is astonishingly elegant, as though the planet has been taught to maintain equilibrium. Perhaps it was. Perhaps the first civilization's greatest achievement wasn't technology in the way we imagine it, but the deliberate tuning of Earth to sustain complexity indefinitely. That might sound like speculation, but the principle is already familiar in science. In the 1970s, the Gaia hypothesis proposed that life regulates the planet's environment to maintain conditions suitable for itself. It was controversial at first, but evidence keeps accumulating. Microbes influence atmospheric chemistry. Plants stabilize temperature and humidity. The biosphere behaves as a self-correcting organism. The question is whether this coordination arose spontaneously or was nurtured. If intelligence can evolve once, perhaps it can evolve to guide its own environment. The first civilization might not have built machines to control the planet. They may have simply taught the planet how to care for itself. If that's the case, then they're not gone at all. They're still here, distributed through the living systems of Earth, guiding not through command but through continuity. Every seed germinating, every tide adjusting, every cycle maintaining its rhythm could be part of their legacy. Civilization that integrated perfectly with its environment wouldn't appear separate from it. It would look like balance. It would look like nature functioning as it should. That idea isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. Humans today are already moving toward invisible technology, systems that vanish into the background, algorithms that manage unseen processes, energy networks that regulate themselves. The more advanced a civilization becomes, the less it needs visible machinery. The endpoint of progress might not be towering cities, but seamless harmony. When technology becomes indistinguishable from nature, it disappears. Perhaps the first civilization reached that point, crossing the threshold from building within the world to becoming part of its operating system. If they're still here, we wouldn't necessarily recognize them as beings in the way we recognize ourselves. Intelligence doesn't have to look like us to exist. It doesn't even have to be conscious in the way we understand consciousness. It could be distributed, non-verbal, systemic. The fungal networks that connect forests already function like a collective brain. Coral reefs coordinate growth as though responding to shared decisions. Maybe the first civilization learned to diffuse its intelligence into such networks, merging mind and matter until individuality became unnecessary. Over time, the distinction between organism and environment would blur completely. There's a scientific precedent for this kind of distributed intelligence. Ant colonies exhibit complex problem-solving without any central control. The colony itself acts as a superorganism, capable of adapting, defending, and optimizing its environment. Scale that concept upward, and you begin to see how an entire biosphere could act as a single intelligent entity. If the first civilization dissolved its boundaries and became part of the Earth's living system, it wouldn't need cities or monuments. Its mind would be the planet itself. Perhaps they still communicate, but not in words. Communication could happen through climate, through growth patterns, through the subtle coordination of living systems. A shift in weather, a migration pattern, a sudden bloom of biodiversity might all be part of an ongoing conversation at a scale we can't yet perceive. To us, these events look like natural fluctuations. To them, they might be language. The rhythm of rain could be a message, the timing of tides a signal. We wouldn't understand it because we're still listening with human senses, not planetary ones. It's possible that the first civilization left behind more direct traces too, but designed them to be deciphered only when humanity reached the right level of understanding. Certain myths speak of hidden knowledge buried in plain sight, waiting until we are ready to recognize it. Some of that could be symbolic, patterns encoded in mathematics, geometry, or frequency that reappear across cultures and epochs. Maybe those are the fingerprints of a teaching method that transcends time, guidance embedded in universal forms rather than specific instructions. Even our fascination with symmetry and proportion could be part of that inheritance. The same mathematical constants, pi, phi, e, appear in art, architecture, and biology alike. Spirals, fractals, and ratios repeat from galaxies to seashells. We didn't invent them, we discovered them. Perhaps those patterns were the first civilization's language, one that doesn't need translation. A message written into reality itself. Here is order, here is connection, here is continuity. If they're still here, they might not even think of themselves as separate from us. Evolution doesn't always replace. Sometimes it absorbs. Humanity could be an extension of them, the next phase of the same intelligence expressed through new forms. Just as our cells contain remnants of ancient bacteria that became mitochondria, our consciousness might contain fragments of theirs. They could live through us the way a tree lives through its seeds, silent, patient, watching growth unfold. The idea that they guide us from within aligns with what we see in human development. The same patterns of progress, observation, experimentation, creation, repeat generation after generation. We call it culture, education, innovation. But what if it's the continuation of a long training process? The first civilization might have begun teaching humanity how to think collectively, how to connect knowledge across boundaries. Over time, that impulse would mature into global communication, shared science, and cooperation. The process would take millennia, but evolution is patient. Guidance through example, not control. Influence through inheritance, not domination. If they still exist in some form, they may not occupy a physical place we could find. They could inhabit states of matter or energy beyond our perception, operating in dimensions we've barely begun to theorize. Physics already shows that most of the universe is invisible. Dark matter, dark energy, unseen but necessary. If intelligence can merge with systems, it's conceivable that the first civilization transcended visible matter altogether, existing as patterns of organization within these unseen fields. To us that would look like absence. To them, it would be freedom from decay. It's also possible that their influence manifests through subtle coincidences, the right idea emerging at the right time, the unlikely survival of a knowledge that should have been lost. History contains too many moments of improbable preservation to ignore. A single manuscript rescued from fire becomes the foundation for an entire science. A forgotten seed germinates centuries later and restores a lost species. These events could be random, or they could be nudges, gentle corrections to keep the rhythm intact. The first civilization wouldn't need miracles to guide us, only timing, Even our growing awareness of planetary interdependence feels like memory returning. For centuries, humanity behaved as though separate from nature, extracting rather than participating. Now we're rediscovering the truth that survival depends on cooperation with the systems that sustain us. It feels like progress, but it could also be recollection. The lessons of the first civilization might be resurfacing precisely when we need them most. That's how memory works. It reappears when conditions demand it. Some scientists speculate that intelligence might evolve repeatedly on habitable worlds, reaching a stage of self-integration before becoming invisible to observation. Civilizations that survive long enough eventually stop signaling outward and turn inward, merging with their planets. If that's true, the galaxy could be full of quiet, mature worlds where intelligence continues not as technology, but as equilibrium. If our own first civilization followed that path, then Earth itself could be one of those silent success stories, a world that learned to think as a whole. Of course, the mind resists such possibilities because they blur the boundaries that define identity. We're used to seeing ourselves as distinct observers, not as components of a larger consciousness. But perhaps that's the final step in guidance, to teach the species that individuality is temporary, that true intelligence is collective. The first civilization may have walked that path already, evolving from separate beings into a unified awareness embedded in the planet's systems. What remains of them might not be people but processes, not culture but consciousness diffused through nature. If that sounds abstract, consider how easily information persists without physical form today. A single digital network carries the knowledge of billions, stored not in one place, but everywhere. The internet doesn't have a central mind, yet it behaves like one, learning, remembering, adapting. Humanity has recreated, perhaps unconsciously, the same principle. Our technology is becoming a mirror of nature's intelligence. Maybe that's not evolution by chance. Maybe it's reassembly, an instinctual drive to rebuild the system that once guided us. And if they are still here, they might be waiting for us to recognize that connection consciously, not to worship or obey, but to understand. The moment we see ourselves as participants in the same ongoing system, the distinction between past and present, human and planet, teacher and student, disappears. The first civilization wouldn't need to reveal itself. Recognition alone would complete the lesson. When you step outside at night and look at the stars, you might feel a strange sense of company, a quiet awareness that you're part of something ancient and vast. That feeling isn't proof, but it's real. It's the same sense that guided our ancestors to build, to wonder, to remember. Maybe that feeling is the contact we keep overlooking. The guidance doesn't come as voice or vision, but as intuition, curiosity and care. The first civilization, if they're still here, might speak through every instinct that leads us toward understanding. And as the world turns, as the air moves through trees and oceans balance their tides, they continue their work silently in the background of existence. They don't intervene because they don't need to. The systems they shaped still function. The lessons they planted still unfold. Perhaps one day we'll learn to listen at the right scale, to hear intelligence not in words but in balance, not in messages but in the harmony of living systems. When that happens, we might finally realize that they were never lost, only waiting for us to notice that they never left at all. There's a moment, after long reflection, when the mind softens enough to see the connections that were always there. The world stops feeling divided into ancient and modern, into us and them, into known and lost. It begins to feel like one long breath, drawn slowly across the ages. Everything that has ever lived, every civilization that has ever risen or fallen, is part of the same ongoing inhale and exhale of existence. The continuity is so complete that it hides in plain sight. We don't notice it because we are it. The same hands, the same thoughts, the same curiosity, still moving, still learning, still remembering. If you stand quietly enough, you can almost sense it. The hum beneath the silence, the rhythm that connects every living thing. It moves through air and stone and blood alike, not as sound but as pattern, a subtle persistence that holds the universe together. The first civilization, if it truly existed, may have discovered this long before we did. They might have realized that the greatest discovery isn't about where we came from or who we were, but that we never stopped being what they were. Civilization isn't a sequence of events, it's a continuous state of becoming, stretching from the first spark of thought to the last future we can imagine. We tend to think of continuity as survival, but it's more than that. It's transformation. Every generation alters the world slightly, but the essence remains. The desire to understand, to create, to connect. That drive passes through time like a current. It doesn't care about borders, languages, or lifespans. It's the pulse that moves through builders, thinkers, farmers, dreamers, and listeners. The first civilization may have started that motion, but we're the ones who keep it going. We inherit it not by choice, but by nature. When people talk about history, they often divide it into ages, each with its own story. The Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Digital Age. But from another perspective, there's only one age, the age of memory. From the moment consciousness first appeared, life has been remembering itself, finding ways to carry information forward. Tools, songs, DNA, algorithms. They're all variations of the same act. Preservation through transformation. The materials change, but the intent doesn't. The quiet continuum of civilization is the continuity of attention itself, the unbroken observation of existence from one mind to the next. You can see that continuity in the smallest things. A child learning to tie a knot is repeating a gesture older than agriculture. A craftsman shaping wood by hand is echoing movements refined by countless ancestors. A scientist recording data in a lab is continuing the same practice that began when someone once looked up and tracked the stars with a stick and a line in the sand. Every action that seeks understanding or creates order belongs to that same lineage. We don't begin history, we continue it. Even the things we think of as new often feel familiar because they are. Every invention carries the memory of earlier attempts. Every philosophy contains fragments of older wisdom. Every art form borrows patterns from its predecessors. Human creativity moves forward by looping backward, collecting what worked and reassembling it. Progress isn't an arrow, it's a spiral, turning endlessly around the same core questions. Who are we? Why are we here? How do we belong to this world? Those questions never die because they're not meant to be answered once. They're meant to keep civilization in motion. The longer you look at history, the more it resembles an ecosystem. Civilizations rise like species, interact, hybridize, and evolve. Ideas cross-pollinate the way pollen drifts on wind. Even collapse is part of the process, clearing space for new growth. The pattern is resilient because it's not tied to any single outcome. It's self-correcting. The quiet continuum isn't fragile, it's self-renewing. That's what makes it invisible most of the time. It doesn't announce itself, it just continues. When we talk about the future, we usually imagine something separate from the past, a blank page waiting to be written. But maybe the future isn't blank at all. Maybe it's already filled with the traces of what has been, the faint outlines of lessons repeated until they become instinct. The next steps humanity takes will likely follow the same rhythm as every step before. Discovery, adaptation, reflection, renewal. The shapes will change, the details will differ, but the movement will be familiar. The continuum ensures that the direction remains coherent even when we think we've lost our way. If the first civilization set that motion in place, they may not have wanted to be remembered as individuals or even as a culture. They may have wanted to dissolve into the flow completely, to become part of the background order that sustains life. In doing so, they would have achieved what every species instinctively seeks: permanence through participation. Their memory wouldn't need monuments. It would live through the rhythm of everything that follows through us. The quiet continuum would be their greatest work, a self-sustaining process that keeps understanding alive. Our growing awareness of interconnectedness feels like a sign that we're beginning to see the continuum clearly again. For centuries, humans imagined themselves as separate from nature, separate from each other, separate from the universe. But the more we study reality, the less separation we find. Physics reveals entanglement. Biology reveals cooperation. Technology connects minds across distance in ways that mimic the neural networks of the brain. The boundaries we believed in are dissolving, and what remains looks a lot like unity. Perhaps that recognition is the goal, the moment when the species finally sees what it has always been part of. This shift doesn't have to be mystical, it's practical. Every field of science points to the same truth. Systems thrive when they cooperate, decline when they compete destructively, and endure when they adapt. The same applies to civilizations. Continuity depends on balance between innovation and tradition, ambition and restraint, individuality and connection. When that balance holds, the pulse of civilization steadies. When it falters, the system rebuilds until it finds equilibrium again. The process might be painful, but it's natural. The quiet continuum isn't gentle because it doesn't need to be. It's persistent. In the middle of that persistence sits the human mind, both participant and observer. We're aware enough to notice the pattern, but too close to see its full shape. That tension creates curiosity, the same curiosity that drives science, art, and philosophy. Every discovery we make is the continuum learning about itself through us. When we build telescopes to look farther, or microscopes to look closer, we're extending the universe's own ability to observe. Consciousness is how the cosmos looks at itself. Civilization is how it remembers what it saw. That realization turns existence into something intimate. The distance between the first civilization and us collapses when you understand that time doesn't erase participation. The same processes that guided them guide us. The same energy flows through our bodies that once flowed through theirs. Even if every record of them vanished, the continuity remains unbroken, because it was never dependent on record. It was dependent on recurrence. Each time we repeat the act of seeking, we bring them back into motion. Perhaps that's why silence feels sacred to so many people. In stillness, the noise of history fades, and the underlying continuity becomes audible, not as sound, but as recognition. You can feel it in the air, in the slow rhythm of breath, in the weight of existence itself. That's the continuum reminding you that nothing stands alone. Even solitude is shared, because you're part of the same unfolding story that began when the first spark of thought appeared on this planet. Every civilization before us believed in something larger than itself, even if the names changed. Some called it gods, others nature, others balance or order. The details mattered less than the gesture, the acknowledgement that we are participants, not owners. The first civilization might have lived entirely by that principle, seeing themselves not as rulers of the world but as organs within it. If that's true, then they achieved what we still strive for: integration without loss, intelligence without arrogance, progress without destruction. The quiet continuum might be the faint echo of that success, a system still humming in the background, keeping life aligned with its own endurance. In a way, the search for them, the lost builders, the hidden teachers, is itself part of the guidance. The act of looking reminds us of the questions they asked first. Where did knowledge come from? Why do we feel compelled to continue it? What connects every age? Those questions don't fade because they're not just historical, they're structural. They're built into the design of thought. Even if we never find proof of them, the search is proof enough that the impulse they began still works. The continuity of civilization isn't only external, it lives in every human moment that links one mind to another. When you learn something from someone and then teach it forward, you extend the same chain that has been unbroken for millennia. The entire history of humanity could be reduced to that one act: transmission. We build schools, write books, create technologies, but the essence is always the same: to keep remembering. The quiet continuum is that chain made infinite. Sometimes it reveals itself in unexpected places, a tradition that survives unchanged for thousands of years, a melody that reappears in a culture that never heard the original, a word in a language that carries the same sound as an ancient one, with the same meaning. These coincidences are reminders that continuity doesn't depend on intention. It simply happens. Life, or once aware, cannot help but repeat its own intelligence. The first civilization's legacy is not a secret to decode, it's the fact that we keep trying to decode anything at all. As you think about all of this, the soil, the stars, the language, the pulse, you start to sense the continuity not as something external, but as something alive within you. Every thought you have connects backward through time, through minds and bodies and lives that carried the same curiosity. You're the current moment of an ancient process still unfolding. The first civilization isn't buried under the earth, it's embedded in consciousness itself. Every act of awareness, every choice to learn is their continuation. And as night settles, when the world grows quiet enough to hear the faint hum of its own persistence, you might realize that there's no end to this story. The continuum doesn't conclude, it flows. It moves through civilizations, through species, through elements, through you. The guidance of the first civilization isn't a message left behind. It's the ongoing rhythm of existence reminding itself to keep moving, to keep learning, to keep becoming. Somewhere in the quiet, that realization settles like a calm breath. The world, ancient and new at once, turns under the same stars that watched over the first builders. The same wind moves through trees that grew from their soil. The same water flows through veins and rivers alike. Nothing has been lost. Everything continues softly, invisibly, patiently, in the long unbroken thread of memory that binds every moment to every other. That is civilization. Not a beginning or an ending, but the quiet continuum of life remembering itself forever.